Richard and Sister Lisa stayed at Lilith's place that night, saving themselves the trouble of hunting for an inn. When evening settled in, the three of them ate together. Lilith talked the whole time, and for once the conversation wasn't just dry lessons or book knowledge. She spoke about life beyond the kingdom, the kind of stories you only hear from someone who has actually been out there. Compared to Olivia, who usually buried herself in books and recited things like a scholar, Lilith's stories had heat, dirt, danger, real places, real people. For Richard, it was almost unreal. He had just seen the scale of a provincial capital, and he still hadn't even set foot in the royal capital. Everything outside the kingdom felt like another world. Lilith told them about stronger kingdoms and about empires, the kind of powers that didn't just rule cities, they swallowed nations. In this world, you didn't build a kingdom by luck. A kingdom only stood because someone in that era had obtained world magic ether. And even then, a kingdom was still a step below an empire. For a royal family to raise a kingdom into an empire, it wasn't enough for one person to hold that power. More than one member of the bloodline had to possess a world magic ether. That was the threshold. Then Lilith talked about the other side of the map. The lawless lands. Huge regions with no lords, no order, no protection. Places where you could run into crime just by walking down the road, and where normal life was something people only remembered from childhood. And that was still within the land of humans. Dinner dragged on longer than planned because neither Richard nor Sister Lisa wanted it to end. Lilith's stories had pulled them in completely. But once they finished eating, Richard didn't head to his room. He stepped outside instead. A city like this, and he was supposed to sleep immediately? No chance. The moment he left the house, the system messages popped up in a neat line. Ding! Your mastery over Codex of Moonshadow has increased from 11% to 14%. Your mastery over 100 Shadow Monster has increased from 11% to 14%. Your mastery over Lighting of Darkness has increased from 11% to 14%. Codex of Dragon Emperor, 31%. Codex of Moonshadow, 14%. Arcane Art, 100 Shadow Monster, 14%. Lighting of Darkness, 14%. Mind Attack, 3%. Richard clicked his tongue. Too bad it wasn't Mind Attack. Still, he wasn't upset. He had already figured out the basics of using it. Practice mattered more than percentage right now. He walked out of Lilith's housing complex and into the city streets. It had to be around 10 at night, yet the city was still loud and active. Shops weren't fully shut. Side streets were busy. People moved like nighttime was normal here. Most of the faces he saw looked rough, the kind of people who lived on shortcuts and bad habits. Ordinary humans. Richard didn't spot a single magus nearby. That made sense too. Magi trained at night. They didn't waste time wandering streets. And even if the city had many ethereal realm magi, they were still nothing compared to the sheer number of regular people. Then Richard noticed a bald young man near the road. He looked like someone who'd just lost a gamble and his dignity with it. He wore expensive robes, yet his shoes were gone, and he kept scratching his bare head like it could fix his luck. The man walked past Richard without even noticing him. Richard didn't look at the man's clothes. He stared at his head. Quietly, he shaped his ether into something invisible, something like the wave element, but stranger, finer, almost too subtle to feel. The wave element could be unseen, but it still had presence. This was thinner than air. It slipped straight from Richard's mind and pierced into the bald man's. An ordinary human had zero defense. The attack entered the man's brain without sound, without resistance, without leaving a trace. Instantly, Richard felt the connection lock. Control. Complete control. So, this is how it works. What shocked him most wasn't that it worked. It was how it felt. The bald man suddenly seemed like an extension of Richard's own body. Like moving him was as natural as moving a finger. He could even decide what the man remembered. Whether the man stayed aware. Whether the man would later question anything at all. Line of sight is enough, Richard realized. As long as I can see them, I can strike. The bald man turned toward him with a blank face. Richard lifted a hand and waved once, like dismissing a servant. Then he released the mind attack. He needed more testing, especially against magi, against minds that could actually fight back. So he kept walking, searching for someone worth the effort. Finding a magus at night was harder, but not impossible. Eventually, he spotted one. A man in his 30s riding a horse, entering the city like he'd just come back from somewhere outside. The way he carried himself, the pressure around him. Richard could tell he wasn't weak. Ether will realm, at least. In raw ether, that man was likely 5 or 6,000 or more. Stronger than Richard in quantity. But Richard's ether had better quality. Richard let the man pass. He waited until the rider was about 10 meters ahead. Then he struck. Mind attack shot out like lightning, aiming straight for the man's brain. The man stiffened instantly, eyes widening. Not good. He felt it. He immediately poured power into his head, resisting with everything he had. His face darkened. He managed to hold it back, but it wasn't free. He had to keep feeding strength into defense just to stop the takeover. And then, in the next moment, the pressure vanished. Richard had already withdrawn the attack and walked away, smiling to himself. Now he understood what Lilith meant when she said mental arts were terrifying. Yes, someone strong enough could resist. But they paid for it by splitting their power. Even that rider, with all his strength, seemed forced to use more than half his focus just to keep his mind intact. In a real fight, that disadvantage would be deadly. Richard's satisfaction was quiet but deep. Then something else caught his eye. Up ahead, he saw the same girl from earlier, the one he'd noticed at Lilith's house. She wore a full black robe now, hood up, walking alone along the roadside. If she hadn't been so close, and if he hadn't caught a glimpse of her face, he would never have recognized her. The girl noticed him too. Her eyes flicked to him like she remembered seeing him at Lilith's place. She frowned slightly and kept walking, passing him without a word. Richard slowed just a bit, watching her go. What is she doing out here this late, alone? Richard didn't have a destination anyway. Curiosity pulled him more than the streets did, so once he put a little distance between them, he followed the girl. He didn't expect her to slip into a narrow alley that opened into a slum district, bigger than Purple Rose Village and twice as grim. Richard stopped at the alley entrance and leaned against the wall of a nearby building, half hidden. It was dark, but his eyesight was sharp enough to keep track of her movements. Then something flashed in her hand. A sword. Not a normal blade either. It was red, so red it looked like it had been dipped in blood and never cleaned. Her presence startled a few drunk men sprawled around the slum entrance. To them, she was just a black-robed figure. Tall for her age, sure, but still obviously young. Too young to be taken seriously. They didn't understand what they were looking at. Until she moved. Whoosh! She lunged. Fast enough that even Richard's eyes widened. She hadn't reached the ethereal realm, yet her speed was already beyond what an ordinary human could react to. The first man didn't even realize he was dying. The blade passed his neck, clean and cold, and his head separated as if his body hadn't gotten the message yet. And then it didn't stop. It turned into a slaughter. The girl flowed through the alley like a storm, her sword rising and falling, cutting throats without pause. Drunks, old men, anyone in her path. Blood sprayed the walls and soaked the ground. Yet strangely, the screams never carried. No one outside the alley reacted. Passers-by walked by like nothing was happening. Richard narrowed his eyes and finally saw it. A faint cube of light spread from the girl, covering the slum zone like a lid. A sound barrier. So that was why nobody heard. Is she planning to wipe out the entire place? Richard thought, stunned. This isn't revenge. This is abnormal. And then she started going after people who weren't even involved. Women stepping out of doors. Children peeking from windows. Richard felt a chill crawl up his spine. This was excessive. Too much. Wrong in a way that made his stomach tighten. But he stayed still and watched. The girl moved into houses, one after another, like she decided no one here deserved to breathe. When it finally ended, she returned to the alley mouth calmly, as if she'd just finished a chore. Her eyes glowed brighter, a sharp red light, then narrowed. Richard smiled. So she noticed me. He hadn't even planned to hide, so it didn't matter. Whoosh! She shot toward him and appeared in front of him almost instantly. Before Richard could say a word, she grabbed his hand and yanked him toward the alley. He could have resisted easily. He didn't. He let her drag him in. Inside the alley, she shoved him toward a door. It was unlocked. The door swung open, and she pushed him inside. A cramped storeroom. Scrap piles. Broken junk. Things nobody wanted. Torches burned on the walls, giving the room an orange glow. She stepped in behind him, slammed the door, and pulled down her hood. Her face was young, but her eyes were not. "Why were you following me?" she asked, voice cold and controlled. Richard glanced at her calmly. "Or maybe I was just walking and happened to look into the alley." The girl didn't buy it. She raised the red sword and pointed it at his throat. The tip touched skin. One small push, and it would pierce in. Richard didn't flinch. He kept smiling, which only made her brows tighten. "I just wanted to know you," he said lightly. Then, as if it was normal conversation, he added, "And I'm curious. Why did you slaughter those people?" Her eyes hardened. "So you saw." She didn't deny it. "That's not your business. If you weren't Princess Lilith's guest, I would have killed you already." Richard took a step back. She stepped forward immediately, keeping the blade pressed near his neck, like distance itself annoyed her. Richard studied her for a moment, then spoke slowly. "I get it. You're under pressure. Constant pressure. You're carrying too much, thinking too much. And there's nobody who truly cares about you." He let that hang for a second. "And you don't let yourself care about anyone either." The girl's expression cracked. Not fully, but enough. Anger flashed, then sorrow, then frustration, then something like exhausted disappointment. Her eyes widened, and her hand trembled around the sword hilt. For a moment, she looked like she'd been hit harder than any attack. Then she forced her face back into control. "What nonsense are you saying?" she snapped. "Unless." Her gaze sharpened. "You don't know who I am?" Richard shrugged like it didn't matter. "Having a grand background doesn't guarantee a good life." That line landed even deeper. Her breathing tightened. The sword almost slipped. "You," she whispered, like she hated him for being right. Richard chuckled softly and took a step toward the door. "It's fine. We don't need to get acquainted properly yet. Maybe later, when you actually feel safe." He expected her to strike. She didn't. She just glared, cold and furious, but her body didn't move. Richard opened the door and left. Outside, the air felt strange. He was surprised at his own reaction. He felt concern. And something else, faint and hard to explain, like an invisible thread connecting them. He shook the thought away and walked toward the brighter districts, blending into the flow of the city. Even at night, the place felt alive. Too alive. He passed several bustling zones and had to choose where to go next. Then he spotted something that pulled his attention instantly. A massive academy, lit up and active even at this hour. Students wandered in groups, couples strolling openly, laughing like they didn't fear the world outside their walls. Richard remembered hearing that Ren, one of tomorrow's finalists, studied here and lived on campus. Final year student. This was the Royal Academy. Even nobles with strong backgrounds studied here because the kingdom brought in top instructors, the best Magus teachers money could buy. Richard didn't want school, but he couldn't deny the place was impressive. He circled around, studying the buildings and watching the students. Some wore uniforms that looked oddly modern, trousers, skirts, purple shirts with red stripes, and the royal emblem stamped proudly on the chest. The academy apparently took students as young as 5, but the younger kids were nowhere in sight. Probably asleep. Only the older ones still roamed the grounds. Richard's wandering drew a few curious looks, nothing more. In a place like this, conflicts were common, strong bullying weak, but nobody cared enough to pick on a 7-year-old. He kept walking. Then, in a quieter area, something happened so suddenly his body reacted before his mind did. A soft hand covered his mouth. Another arm wrapped around his waist. And someone pulled him backward into the dark.
Hey everyone, Firescale Audiobooks here. If there's a novel you'd love to hear more of, you can support us on Patreon or Ko-fi. Depending on your tier, I'll make extra parts just for the stories you're most excited about. Usually I can only upload 4 to 5 parts of each novel, but with your support, we can go beyond that. And of course, don't forget to hit subscribe. It helps more than you know.
Richard glanced upward instinctively and found that it was done by a beautiful woman who looked around 20 years old, with short black hair, wearing an academy uniform, but in different colors, blue with white stripes. It was clearly also a Royal Academy uniform, but perhaps from a different branch. Richard suspected it was from the Royal Academy of another province, since there was only one in each province. After covering his mouth, the woman pulled him into a narrow alley before running while dragging him along. Richard was not incapable of resisting, though he felt this woman was indeed stronger. She seemed to be among the top ranks of magi in the ethereal realm. However, Richard was somewhat curious about who this woman was, so he allowed himself to be taken for now. If there was danger, he would rampage for a bit before shouting. Whoosh! Suddenly, the woman leaped through the window of a luxurious inn room, a window that happened to be open, or perhaps it had been her room from the start. Darling, I caught one of the students from this province's Royal Academy. He's only 7 years old. You can use your disguise skill to become him and sneak into the academy building. After all, with his age, fewer people would be suspicious of his movements. As long as you can find Ren and sabotage his preparations, you'll definitely win tomorrow. The important thing is that you win here, then my father surely won't refuse you anymore as my husband. The woman spoke after entering the room. Richard saw the luxurious room, brightly lit, with a large bed seemingly covered in silk. A young man of about 20 with white hair sat on the bed, wearing the same uniform as the woman except he wore trousers. He was very striking for a man, in a different way, with a few sword scars on his handsome face that actually added to his charm. For a moment, he seemed surprised by what the short-haired woman had brought. Darling, why did you do this? I won't lose to that Ren, he said with a wry smile. I know you won't lose, but it means you'd have to pay a heavy price. You are indeed stronger than Ren, but he has a vile trick that is very dangerous. Our intelligence has discovered that Ren has prepared everything so his vile trick could defeat you, the woman replied. At this point, Richard finally realized he had been kidnapped by the lover of a man named Gray, one of the finalists, Ren's opponent. He was from the 9-star province, rather phenomenal because he came from an ordinary background and was now dating the daughter of that province's governor, Laura. Richard had heard quite a lot of people talk about him tonight because many commoners preferred to support him. After Laura spoke, Gray seemed to ponder while staring at Richard, who had now been released by her. She then approached the man and touched his face. I just don't want there to be any more obstacles between us, Laura said softly. As she spoke, Gray, who initially didn't want to resort to cheating, suddenly looked hesitant. Wouldn't this mean I wouldn't be passing your father's requirement in a fair way? Gray said. Why do you care about that? From the start, this has always been about our relationship, Laura replied. Come on, copy this boy's appearance, she added, glancing at Richard. Gray looked at Richard, doubt still on his face. But in the end, he nodded to Laura. Boy, don't worry, this won't hurt and won't affect you at all. I'll only store the data of your appearance in my memory, Gray said to Richard. After saying that, he placed his finger on Richard's forehead, which suddenly glowed and enveloped his whole body. Richard realized it wasn't dangerous because it only touched the surface of his skin, not penetrating into his flesh. In just a moment, Gray withdrew his finger from his forehead. Without sending his power into Richard's body, he did not detect that Richard also possessed immense strength. Of course, Richard would never allow foreign power to enter his body. He would rather rampage even if it exposed his identity. He was then stunned. The tall Gray suddenly shrank, and his appearance changed exactly into Richard's. Even his clothes turned into the same as Richard's. What did you do? Richard asked instinctively. I promise this won't cause you any trouble. I'll only use your appearance to enter the academy, and I'll make sure my actions won't be detected, Gray replied. You can't do that. I'm not a student of that academy, Richard answered. What? This time, the pair were the ones stunned. "Boy, I caught you at the academy," Laura said, only for Richard to cut her off. "I was just wandering around there. If you don't believe me, go ahead and try. The academy building definitely won't let you, who's using my appearance, enter." "Gray." "Laura." Gray returned to his original form, looking at Laura, and she now seemed awkward. "Darling, I can kidnap another one," Laura said, but Gray shook his head. "I always follow the guidance of fate, and this clearly proves fate wants me to stay on my path without cheating," Gray replied with a look full of determination. When he had shown that gaze, Laura could only open her mouth without speaking. "Can you both let me go now?" Richard asked. Gray nodded, saying nothing, but headed toward the door. "Thank you," Richard said with a smile before walking to that door. Just as he opened it, he saw the white-haired man already embracing Laura, as if trying to comfort her for making the mistake of catching the wrong person. And Laura returned his embrace. Soon, it might begin, but Richard, who had already left their room, was too lazy to close their door. He saw the stairs and went down. Now, he decided he would just go home to Lilith's house and sleep. Wandering alone in the city at night didn't seem entirely good. Richard still knew the way home because he only needed to follow the main road. When he arrived at Lilith's house, he found the woman sitting alone on the terrace with a glass of wine beside her. "Richard, so fast," she said when she saw him, thinking he would be gone longer. "Outside is too full of trouble. I'd rather just sleep," Richard replied. "Finally you understand. That's how life is in a big city. If you don't make trouble for others, others will make trouble for you," Lilith said with a chuckle. Richard rolled his eyes at that. "What are you doing here, Sister Lilith?" Richard asked. "Relaxing, but actually my mind is training to increase my strength," the woman replied. "So you can train this way? I don't have to sit in a room and close my eyes. Even like this, it's not a problem for me. No wonder you're a genius, but it seems you're still below that woman they call Lady Rebecca." "Who said I'm below her? She's just older. Give me time, and we can't say who will be stronger in the future." Although Lilith seemed to acknowledge Rebecca's talent, she clearly refused to be called inferior. Richard wasn't so sure. He then asked permission to enter the house. There were 3 rooms in the house, and Richard was given the smallest one, though it still had a large, very soft bed. When he lay down on that extremely comfortable bed, he quickly fell asleep. Ding! Your affinity with the cloud element has increased from 60% to 70%. Cloud, 70%. Richard received the notification when he woke up in the morning. He wasn't too excited, since it was just elemental affinity that had increased. Seeing that the sun was already faintly shining, he immediately sat up and stretched. This city should have more ether, so absorbing it would take less time, but he hadn't had time to train yet. After stretching, he stood up, left his room, only to find Lilith sitting in the living room wearing nothing but a towel wrapped around her body, revealing her thighs and her long, fair legs. She looked like she had just finished bathing, the fragrance of her body blending with the air, making it feel fresher. She was drying her blonde hair, which looked even brighter when wet. Richard didn't need to have had an adult's life in the past to be distracted by such a sight. After all, 7 years old, especially in this world, even a boy of his age already knew what beauty was. Lilith smiled when she noticed him staring. "Anyway, you'd better take a bath if you want to watch the tournament finals. Lisa is already ready and she's out buying breakfast. After breakfast, you two have to leave immediately or you won't get seats," Lilith said. "Yes." Richard only nodded before heading to the bathroom. It was a luxurious, spotless bathroom with a refreshing fragrance. Soap at least already existed in this world, though only enjoyed by certain circles. Naturally, Lilith had it. The water was warm, making Richard feel not only refreshed, but also deeply comfortable. He didn't bathe for long and immediately put on his clothes in the bathroom. When he came out, he didn't see Lilith anymore, probably in her room getting dressed. Coincidentally, Sister Lisa entered from outside, carrying food that seemed to consist of toast and warm milk. Come, let's eat breakfast." Lilith came out of her room at the same time, wearing a new dress similar to yesterday's. "Lilith, are you going to watch too?" Lisa asked. "No, I'm not interested in fights at this level," but of course, I have other activities, Lilith replied. Lisa nodded, not trying to ask what she planned to do, since someone like Lilith practically always had many things going on. They sat at the dining table and began breakfast. Richard, have you started practicing mind attack? Lilith asked. Yeah, I've tried it, Richard answered. What do you think? I can't really say yet because I don't even have enough accumulation in practicing that arcane art. But I think if I become stronger, maybe there's hope. Richard deliberately said that so Lilith would help him become stronger. The woman smiled as if she understood his thoughts. Tell me, what could make you stronger in a short time? She asked, seemingly not planning to waste words. I have one arm and one leg from an ether skeleton. Richard answered, his voice a little low. Right or left? Lilith asked again. Both right? All right, I'll find the left parts later. Give me time until night, Lilith said. Even better if there's a torso skeleton too, Richard added. Brat, you're sly too. But let's see the results with those two first. If it works, I'll find you a torso skeleton, Lilith replied. Richard chuckled softly at being called sly. He didn't say more, knowing he couldn't ask for too much. That was only proper once he showed her results. At that time, he could squeeze her if she wanted to experience the effect of mind attack. After breakfast, Richard first helped Sister Lisa clean the table. Lilith, we're heading out now, Lisa said after they were done. Be careful, Lilith reminded. Lisa nodded, then patted Richard's shoulder. Come on, we'll just walk, she said. Richard followed beside her. When they arrived at the city street, he found many people walking in the same direction. Some were still riding carriages, escorted by soldiers, so people gave way. Until now, Richard didn't know the tournament's location. He also hadn't seen a coliseum or heard about tickets for viewing. The road they took wasn't the same one he walked last night, so what he saw was quite unfamiliar. Looking ahead wasn't easy either, for someone his size, with so many people blocking his view. However, it wasn't too long before he saw a sloping road. A massive crater appeared below, as large as 10 football fields, with carved earthen stands encircling it. This was, of course, a coliseum, but built within a crater. Who wants to bet? Come in here. Right here, we are more trustworthy and always fair to our players. Richard suddenly heard shouts from beautiful women standing in front of the luxurious buildings near the coliseum. When he looked closer, they turned out to be gambling houses, but they only accepted payment in nature spirits. Richard was a little interested, but remembering the number of nature spirits he had, he gave up on the idea. Only 10, even if he won, it would just become 20, not worth the trouble of registering. Sister Lisa kept walking forward. Even now, the Colosseum stands were already half full. There was no entrance ticket and no special passage to get inside. One only needed to descend into the stands from above. The soldiers were only there to keep order, not to check anyone entering. There was only one area forbidden to the public, and right now its seats were only partly occupied. That was probably the area for nobles. As they started descending the stands, Richard and Sister Lisa had to push through the crowd. Sister Lisa held Richard's hand tightly, afraid he might get dragged away. Several burly men didn't hesitate to shove others aside just to move forward. Even Richard and Sister Lisa were pushed around several times. It was far more chaotic than entering a football stadium during a final match. Sometimes, an elbow accidentally struck Richard in the face. Sister Lisa was beginning to look annoyed, since as a woman, being touched several times by accident by men was making her uncomfortable. But she had to endure it, unable to simply use her armor. If she got angry, the aura from her armor could send people around them flying. Fortunately, once they got closer to the front, things became easier. Let's sit here. Sister Lisa quickly chose seats, still far from the battle area but clear enough to watch. Richard didn't care where they sat. He immediately took a seat beside Sister Lisa. Moving forward was impossible anyway. Even the seats in their row filled up quickly, leaving only the back rows for latecomers. No sooner had they sat down than Richard heard many discussions from the sides, front, and back. Who do you think will win? Hard to say. Ren seems to have some strange and dangerous power, but I've seen Gray fight several times. He has extraordinary light power. I heard his affinity with the light element has already reached 85%, plus he has various incredible arcane arts. Just because Ren has a tier 3 ether, their strength is actually still balanced. I think Ren is more likely to win. Why do you think so? Having a tier 3 ether shows that Ren is more talented, and he must have more tricks. That's the foolish judgment of someone inexperienced in watching strong Magus battles. Richard occasionally glanced left and right to see the people talking. Some were just having light discussions, but others were outright arguing. Make way for participant Gray. Suddenly Richard heard a loud shout from above, so loud it echoed across the Colosseum. When he looked back, the soldiers were pushing people aside and forcing them to open a path. Richard then saw a white-haired youth appear, wearing his academy uniform. He was, of course, the young man Richard had met last night. Ren came with some of his academy friends, including Laura. Since they weren't the hosts, they didn't look too excited, but in their group was one old man, hunched and walking with a cane. An ordinary person might think he was just some frail old man, but as a Magus, Richard felt an overwhelming threat from him. Richard doubted he was only at the life ether realm, perhaps he was even above that realm. Several captains of the guard, when the group passed them, gave short salutes to the old man, proving his strength. They descended into the Colosseum easily, since no one blocked their way, and there was indeed a special area at the edge of the battlefield for them to sit, similar to a bench for reserve players. Since they came from the same direction as Richard, Ren should come from the opposite side. Richard was curious about this man, but there was still no sign of his arrival. The number of spectators only grew, and soon the entire stands were full. At the back, Richard saw many squeezed together, sitting shoulder to shoulder. On the path leading to the special area, Richard once again saw soldiers clearing the way. That area was beginning to fill, but until now no one had been escorted by soldiers. Richard saw luxurious carriages arriving. Honorable-looking people stepped down from them. Two men stood out more than the rest. One was in his 50s, with a thin white beard, and the other looked in his 40s with neatly kept blonde hair, giving off a friendly impression even while wearing a luxurious red robe. Richard, the blonde one, is the governor, Wilder Hall. Next to him is Victor Moonshadow, elder brother of Lady Rebecca, the current leader of the Moonshadow clan. Even though Lady Rebecca is the strongest in that clan, she doesn't bother with managing it. Victor Moonshadow's strength is equal to Wilder Hall's, but just so you know, in the Moonshadow clan, there are quite a few elders at their level. Sister Lisa whispered to Richard as she explained. Richard narrowed his eyes slightly as he looked at them. Compared to the old man who accompanied Gray's group, these two felt far less threatening. The two walked side by side, chatting as if they were close friends. Others could only follow behind them, including some young men who stood out. They had arrived late but were given front-row seats. "Where's Ren? Why hasn't he come yet?" "Even his father arrived earlier," someone said. He's always late. Luckily his father is the governor. Otherwise, he would have already been disqualified, another person said. "Yeah, I hope he runs into misfortune at least once." Some people who disliked Ren began criticizing him for not showing up yet. But not long after they spoke, soldiers were seen clearing a path on the opposite side of the arena. When the path opened, Richard finally saw someone accompanied by quite a number of Royal Academy students, a blonde-haired man in a black robe, carrying a massive sword. His skin was very pale and his body somewhat thin, giving off the impression of a sickly person, yet he was clearly fine, for he could carry such a large sword on his back. Unlike Gray, who always seemed relaxed and calm, this man was cold, his gaze sharp as though deeply focused. He didn't glance left or right, only stared straight ahead. His popularity in this city was obvious. Many noble girls screamed, calling his name. But he clearly had no interest in responding to anyone. He walked straight to his seat, sitting down with his companions, staring directly at Gray, who was across from him. Gray, however, looked busy chatting with his lover, Laura. Yet after being stared at continuously, he finally turned and looked toward Ren with a faint smile. It seemed Ren was speaking to Gray through his sixth sense. You too, step into the arena. Suddenly a voice echoed from the center of the battlefield. A bald, middle-aged man appeared there, standing as though he had been present all along. Ha ha. It's finally starting. The audience immediately grew excited, some even standing up before being forced back into their seats by soldiers, as their bodies blocked the view of people behind them. Gray and Ren both stepped into the battlefield. But Richard noticed something odd after they communicated using the sixth sense. Gray's expression suddenly looked filled with hesitation. It only became more obvious as he drew closer to Ren, while the latter simply gave him an unfathomable smile. When they stood about 5 meters apart, Gray suddenly turned toward the referee, the bald man. "Referee, I surrender," he said after appearing to think long and hard. "What?" Nearly the entire audience stood up at once. What happened? What kind of nonsense is this? No one has ever surrendered in a final like this. Why is Gray giving up? Gray, I came all this way, spent all my money supporting you, and you dare surrender? At least fight first. There was no way the crowd could remain calm hearing a participant surrender. The result was secondary. What they most wanted to see was a battle between geniuses in the world of magic, an epic clash that was always thrilling to watch. But Gray had spoken. The referee frowned at him. "Are you certain?" the referee asked. Of course, there was no rule forbidding a participant from surrendering. If one chose to yield, their opponent would be declared the winner. Yes. Gray nodded, though his expression was still hesitant. But his expression was of no consequence to the referee. If he surrendered, then Ren would be the victor. Now, that man wore a satisfied smile. Richard glanced toward the noble seating area, looking at Governor Wilderhall and Victor Moonshadow. Even they were surprised. Victor looked at Wilder, as if asking what his son was relying on, but the latter shook his head. Very well. The winner is Ren Hall, who will represent the 8-star province, the 9-star province, and the 10-star province in the capital. The referee announced. Gray immediately turned away, returning to his seat as disbelief showed on the faces around him, Laura included, her eyes trembling. Utterly ridiculous, muttered Sister Lisa beside Richard. She had been very eager to witness the fight, but this outcome was more than just disappointing. In the end, the entire audience left the Colosseum with blank expressions. Some cursed Gray, especially those who had lost their bets on him. Richard scratched his head a few times in confusion. He was disappointed too, thinking he would finally get to compare his own strength against the top geniuses of 3 provinces. When he and Sister Lisa returned to Lilith's house, Lilith had just been about to leave, looking surprised to see them back already. "So soon? Is it over already?" she asked. Lisa shook her head and replied, "One of the participants surrendered before the fight even began. It ended far too quickly." "Oh." Lilith showed a strange expression at hearing that. "That's very rare. Perhaps one of them offered something too tempting to refuse," she said. Lisa seemed to agree. "There's nothing we can do about it, but if you're interested, Lisa, you and Richard can follow me to the capital when the true finals are held." "That will be much more exciting," Lilith said. "Really? You'd take us along?" Lisa looked very interested upon hearing that. Traveling to the capital was no easy feat. Lisa couldn't afford it on her own, as the journey was quite expensive. But if Lilith brought them, that would be different. "It's still a long way off. Just come see me later," Lilith replied. "All right, I'll be going now. My house isn't locked," she added. As the woman stepped out, the crows on her roof suddenly followed her. To Richard's shock, she vanished among them, and then they all soared rapidly into the sky. Those at higher levels truly are extraordinary, he thought. "Richard, is there something you want to do?" Sister Lisa asked. "I'll just train," Richard replied. He wasn't in the mood to do anything else, so he just wanted to cultivate. Sister Lisa nodded, letting him enter the house first. "Sister, are you going somewhere?" Richard asked. "Yes, I want to visit some places that might help me improve my strength." "This is especially for a sky armor knight," Lisa answered. "Okay," Richard said. He went inside Lilith's house, entered his room, and locked it before starting to absorb ether. As he expected, the amount of ether in this city was much greater. They were also much easier to absorb. Compared to when he trained during the journey, Richard could now gather almost twice as much ether. This gave him a strong drive to train nonstop, at least until evening. Back then on the road, he had gathered nearly twice as much thanks to the Black Heart Soul. Now, he was certain he could gather twice as much simply because of the city's environment. By evening, he opened his eyes in delight. Ether, 360/10,000, Tier 3, plus 138. Ether accumulation, 2360, Tier 3. I guess I need to stay in this city longer, he thought. Richard was startled to see a crow standing on his window. What shocked him even more was that the crow had a ring in its beak. Richard, the left hand and foot of the ether skeleton you wanted are in this ring. Lilith's voice suddenly echoed from the crow. The bird then dropped the ring onto Richard's bed before flying away. So fast? It's not even night yet, Richard muttered in surprise. Richard examined the ring casually. It was a storage artifact, though the space inside was far smaller compared to the one he had taken from Damon. He saw two objects, hand and left leg bones that glimmered like diamonds. Without hesitation, he drew them out from within the ring, along with the right side parts stored inside his own. Although the amount of ether he had absorbed was still little, there was no issue with obtaining an ether skeleton earlier. He directly absorbed them into his body. Ding! Your hand and leg bones have been replaced with ether skeletons. You gain an additional 2,000 ether accumulation originating from your ether hand and leg bones. Ether accumulation, 4360, Tier 3. Compared to cultivating, this method is much easier. Unfortunately, raising the realm still requires training for everyone, Richard said. He felt so delighted that he wanted to laugh. But then, his brows furrowed. Is something wrong? He wondered as he looked at his own hands. He wasn't entirely sure what was happening. Nothing felt wrong or uncomfortable, yet his instincts seemed to be searching for a hidden problem inside his body. Meanwhile, in the Royal Academy, inside a dark chamber that served as Ren's training room, the young man who was cultivating suddenly opened his eyes, narrowing them coldly. So the one who killed Damon is here in this city, he muttered with a cruel gaze. The right hand and leg bones Damon once possessed had been his gifts, a reward for carrying out his dirty work. From the very start, he hadn't believed Damon would live long enough to use them, so he had sought the help of an expert to leave behind a tracking seal. It was in anticipation of Damon being slain and his belongings plundered. As long as those bones fused with someone, the mark would activate, allowing him to trace the person. To him, killing his dog was no different from slapping his face. How could he possibly let this go peacefully? If Damon hadn't died, I would have gathered plenty of souls, enough to defeat Gray in an actual fight. But since Damon was killed, my plan failed, and I was forced to pay Gray heavily to make him surrender in the tournament. Ren's eyes grew even colder as he thought of the truth behind the matter. Some believed him to be brilliant for making Gray concede. Even his father and the Moonshadow clan leader had praised him. But reality was far less glorious. He had been forced to do it, and even now it left a bitter taste in his heart. He stood, lifted his great sword, and strapped it across his back. Of course, he would now seek that person out. Richard still hadn't realized what was truly happening, though he knew something was amiss. He trusted his instincts. There was no way they were wrong without reason. For now, he could only wait until Lilith returned. Surely, there was no way that woman wouldn't know what the problem was. He then stood, feeling the urge to walk around again. His confidence had risen drastically after his increase in power. He even felt he might not be far from Gray and Ren's strength. Even if their ether was 3 times greater than his, he could make up for the difference with his elemental affinity that reached 90%, coupled with his mind attack that would effectively weaken them. Just as he stepped out of Lilith's house, he was stunned to see a blond man with cold eyes and a massive sword suddenly appear, standing in the courtyard. Ren. How could he not recognize the man who had just forced Gray to surrender? Why was he here? And why was his gaze so sharp upon him? Before Richard could even think, the man suddenly charged at him. I didn't expect you to be just a child, Ren said coldly. As he lunged, he didn't release any kind of aura, as though he were just an ordinary man, but his speed was enough to make Richard wary. However, bang! A faint light suddenly appeared at the front porch of the house, forcefully rebounding Ren back until he staggered when he landed. Shock flashed across his face as his eyes narrowed sharply. Richard, who had initially been worried, was stunned and then overjoyed. "This is Princess Lilith's house. You'd better not act recklessly here, or your entire clan will be annihilated," Richard said. With that, he retreated back inside, leaning against the door. Fortunately, Lilith had arranged protective formations around her house, or else he would have been in serious trouble, forced to face Ren directly. Even though he wasn't afraid, he knew it would be troublesome. He was beginning to understand what was going on. It had to be because of Damon's death, and Ren had a way to track him. Naturally, he quickly concluded it was related to those bones and the strange sensation he had felt. Would Ren dare oppose me, knowing I'm backed by Lilith? Richard wondered as he peeked out the window, seeing Ren hesitate. He's only the governor's son. Lilith should be stronger than that governor. She's also a princess of the Holy Star Kingdom. What are they compared to her? They should be afraid, Richard thought. Although Lilith had once been a discarded princess, Richard knew her identity had since been restored. The kingdom could never let go of such an extraordinary genius. Yet it was Lilith herself who had chosen not to return, preferring to roam freely. Oh, he's finally leaving. Not long after showing hesitation, Ren turned away with a gloomy expression. Richard almost laughed when he saw his face. After that, he sat down. From late afternoon, the sky gradually darkened. Richard waited for Sister Lisa and Lilith to return. He suddenly heard the cry of a crow outside not long after nightfall. Click! The door opened, revealing Lilith's figure. Her eyes narrowed as she looked at Richard. Did something happen? She asked. It seemed she was aware someone had come with ill intentions. Sister Lilith, it was like this. Richard recounted what had happened. Lilith looked slightly surprised but only smiled. There shouldn't be any problem. That governor, I already beat him up when I first returned to the city, Lilith said casually, before pointing her finger toward Richard. Shwa! Suddenly, a beam of light filled with many symbols emerged from Richard's body, landing in Lilith's hand before shattering into tiny fragments and vanishing. There's no need to be afraid of roaming around. That boy, Ren, is the type who bullies the weak but fears the strong. He won't dare touch you. Perhaps he even thinks you're my disciple, Lilith continued. Hee, Sister Lilith, I'm really grateful you support me, Richard chuckled. Naturally, I'll support you. Besides, I still want to see your adult self someday. You might just be a good match to stand beside me, Lilith replied with a wink, making Richard roll his eyes. His face flushed slightly, something he couldn't control. So this is what it feels like to be teased by a beautiful woman? He wondered. If only he had an adult body, he felt he would have pounced on her already. Richard received Lilith's assurance that Ren would not be able to do anything to him. Even if he tried, according to Lilith, as long as Richard was inside the city, she could practically reach him in an instant. If Richard faced danger, Lilith would be able to help him immediately. Previously, she had been outside the city, which was why she couldn't arrive right away. But because of Ren's appearance, Richard lost his mood to go out, deciding instead to train in his room, absorbing ether until he could no longer stay awake. In the end, he trained until he had gathered 100 ether. This was also because nighttime made absorbing ether slightly more difficult compared to daytime, as many people were doing the same. Ether, 460/10,000, Tier 3, plus 100. Ether accumulation, 4460, Tier 3. Richard fell asleep afterward, and in his sleep, he received a notification. Your mastery of 100 Shadow Monster has increased from 14% to 19%. Your mastery of Lighting of Darkness has increased from 14% to 19%. Arcane Art, 100 Shadow Monster, 19%. Lighting of Darkness, 19%. This increase brought Richard immense satisfaction, and, because he was too drowsy, he continued sleeping until noon. He only woke up at midday quite late, but only then did he feel refreshed. His eyes scanned his statistics. Ether I've absorbed in this realm is only 460, still far from 10,000, he muttered. Even though he had a complete ether skeleton, he was still far from real progress, leaving him dissatisfied. Living in this city made him thirstier for strength because he realized there were many stronger people, especially the older generation, such as the governor or the Moonshadow clan leader. Unfortunately, this was something he still had to go through step by step. Though dissatisfied, there was nothing he could do. He stretched his body and stood, stepping out of his room, only to be surprised by the sight of the black-haired young girl with her maid, sitting in the living room, listening to Lilith explain magic. Apparently, her purpose in coming to Lilith's house was to study, or perhaps to receive some kind of personal guidance. And it seemed that it was about to finish. The girl looked at Richard, and her gaze at him somehow became different, not as cold as yesterday. "Sister Lilith, I'll be taking my leave. I'll come again tomorrow morning," she said as she stood up. Lilith waved her hand, letting her go. Soon after, she left with her maid. "Sister Lilith, who is that girl?" Richard asked curiously. Of course, he had long wanted to ask about the girl's identity. However, he hesitated because he feared Lilith might tease him for having a crush on her. Now, seeing her directly in front of Lilith, he thought it wouldn't be a problem. "Lady Rebecca's adopted daughter, Grace," Lilith casually replied, turning her head back to look at Richard. He couldn't be more shocked. He finally realized why he had felt a certain connection between him and that girl. Indeed, they didn't share blood, but there was something that made their relationship not so distant. Why so surprised? Lilith chuckled, giving Richard a strange look. "Yesterday, I saw her massacre an entire slum," Richard replied. His surprise seemed a little too much, so he could only say that. Lilith wasn't too surprised to hear it. That girl has an incredible talent, but Lady Rebecca pressures her too harshly. Her personality is indeed somewhat problematic. But that's not something I need to take care of, since I'm only paid to teach her magic. Most likely, those she slaughtered were a community that had committed serious crimes, such as being nobles' lackeys and distributing illegal drugs. In essence, she was only helping the kingdom eradicate crime. Lilith was still looking at Richard as she said that. Before she could say anything else, Richard quickly said, "Sister, I'll go bathe first." He then went to the bathroom. Since he had slept until noon, he bathed longer to make his body truly refreshed and fragrant. Lilith was still sitting in the living room when he came out, reading an ancient book. However, he didn't see Sister Lisa. "Sister Lilith, where's Sister Lisa?" Richard asked. "I don't know. She hasn't returned since yesterday," Lilith replied. "She hasn't returned?" Richard was immediately worried upon hearing that. He thought she had come back and then gone out again, but it turned out she hadn't returned at all. Where could she be? "Don't think too much about Lisa. She'll be fine," Lilith said again. "Anyway, there's a good opportunity for you," she added. "What is it?" Richard couldn't help but feel curious when he heard about a good opportunity. "Go to the governor's residence. You'll find out for yourself." The governor's residence? Richard frowned upon hearing that. He felt the governor's residence wasn't the right place for him to go, considering his enmity with Ren. But since Lilith said it was a good opportunity, it would be a shame to miss it. Richard nodded before leaving, walking toward the city center, which was quite far from Lilith's house. The city center was a vast open area in a circular shape, where in the middle stood a majestic castle. There were no walls blocking it. It was surrounded by a river about 10 meters wide, though many bridges crossed over it. Richard saw many people gathered there, from the young to the old. Children around his age were also quite numerous. "Boss, what are they doing here?" Richard asked an old snack vendor by the roadside. Seeing that the one asking was just a small boy, the old man was slightly surprised. "You don't know?" he asked. "No." Richard shook his head because Lilith hadn't told him. He was forced to ask someone else. "The governor will lower the star wheel here," replied the old man. "And what is the star wheel?" This was the first time Richard had heard of it. "Oh, it seems you are not from the city of Night Valley, but from a village or small town," said the old man, because Richard did not know. The star wheel is an artifact left behind by the kingdom's founder. It exists in every province and has the power to absorb starlight from the sky. You may not know this, but starlight contains ether from Tier 1 to Tier 3. When the star will releases its light, it releases the ether it has collected. Magicians can absorb it at this time. Of course, since there are many people, it will be contested. How much ether you can get depends on your ability to absorb it, but practically, you can absorb far more than during normal training. Ether Tier 1 has the most competition, but it also has the greatest quantity of ether. The most fortunate, naturally, is Ren, since he possesses Tier 3 ether. Aside from him, there's no one else, because the condition to participate in this event is that you must not exceed the realm of ether will. Old man, don't forget that Lady Rebecca's daughter also has ether Tier 3. Ren isn't the only one. The merchant beside the old man suddenly interjected. Miss Grace? Even so, she hasn't reached the ether will realm yet. There's no way she can compete with Ren. The old man replied. Richard listened quietly, occasionally nodding as he finally understood the situation. Not long after Grace's name was mentioned, he suddenly saw her step down from her carriage with her maid, instantly drawing the attention of many. As she walked into the governor's castle courtyard, everyone unconsciously stepped back, opening a path for her to pass. Richard, who had been standing at the roadside from the start, didn't need to move. Grace initially gazed straight ahead indifferently, her eyes rarely blinking. But when she drew close to Richard, she still cast her eyes in his direction. She didn't stop, but it looked as though she wanted to approach him. Richard felt as if she already knew more about him through Lilith. Little sister, little sister. Suddenly, a plump young man with black hair, wearing luxurious red robes, ran toward Grace, causing her to furrow her brows. The fat youth was followed by more than 10 guards, all clad in sky armor. Little sister, let's go together, the fat youth said with a wide grin. Grace looked far too lazy to respond, continuing forward while the fat youth insisted on trailing beside her. Who is he? Richard asked. Jack, son of the Moonshadow clan leader. He's rather dim-witted, only capable of indulging himself and bullying others. That clan has been declining, and their younger generation has grown worse. Fortunately, they still have Lady Rebecca, the old man explained with a scornful tone, clearly disliking the fat youth. It doesn't seem so bad living in an orphanage, Richard thought. After that, he saw Gray and Laura together with the students from the Royal Academy of the 9-Star Province. It turned out they had also come. Of course, there was no prohibition against their presence, since they too were citizens of the Holy Star Kingdom. However, people looked at them oddly because of Gray's choice to surrender. The man appeared calm. On the other hand, Laura, beside him, repeatedly pouted, as though harboring a deep grievance. Though from another province, they were still welcomed by the governor's servants and given a special place. Richard, of course, would not miss this opportunity. Grace was not worth mentioning, as she had not yet reached the ethereal realm. This meant his only true rival for the Ether Tier 3 was Ren. He didn't believe he would lose to him in this matter. It was no secret that Ren's Ether Tier 3 was not very stable. This was clearly due to his lack of capability, unlike Richard, who relied on 2 codices and mastered both well. He crossed one of the bridges, moving closer toward the governor's residence. There, he saw Ren chatting with several young nobles around his age. His instincts were sharp. The moment Richard laid eyes on him, Ren looked back, slightly surprised to see it was him. Instantly, Ren's eyes sharpened. Richard grinned at him before walking to a chair and sitting down casually, occasionally glancing at Ren, who didn't bother approaching. Surely, he already knew who Richard was, but perhaps he was too lazy to reveal his identity. It would only draw unwanted attention. Richard quickly turned his gaze toward the governor's castle entrance. The governor had stepped out of the castle with his subordinates. Everyone. He greeted the crowd gathered before his castle. At that moment, something suddenly descended from the sky, like a blinding lump of light. Richard squinted, realizing it was a wheel in shape, but made of something like crystal. The more Richard observed it, the more he felt the ether draw near. That star will clearly stored an immense amount of ether. Its function was likely similar to an ether bottle, though each had its own strengths and weaknesses. An ether bottle had a limit of up to 100 ether, but it could be drunk directly, fusing with the body at once. The ether within the star wheel did not seem to be the kind that could be swallowed directly. It had to be absorbed like ether from nature, yet it appeared far easier to absorb, making it highly coveted. Even the tiers of each ether are separated from one another, so competition is only with those of the same tier. The kingdom's founder seemed to have created the star wheel to aid his people in cultivation. As you all know, the star wheel is only passed down once every 5 years, the governor said. This is because, in 5 years, we must wait for the star wheel to fully gather ether. The amount it holds consists of 300,000 Tier 1 ether, 30,000 Tier 2 ether, and 3,000 Tier 3 ether. Richard and those listening to the governor's words could not help but be astonished. Richard's focus was solely on Tier 3 ether. Though its quantity was the smallest, 3,000 was still an enormous number. After all, he only had 2 rivals, whereas for Tier 1 ether, the competition was overwhelming. The number of magi in the ethereal realm alone was countless, not to mention those who had yet to reach it. Almost all of them relied on Tier 1 ether. Perhaps many of you have already experienced ether from the star wheel yourselves. According to the founder's decree, anyone may partake in absorbing ether from the star wheel, so long as they are in the ethereal realm or below, the governor continued amidst the crowd's excitement. They waited, anticipating the governor to release the ether from the star wheel. The governor looked over the people lined up before him, knowing they had no interest in hearing more empty words. They only wanted the ether from the star wheel. Very well, we shall begin now. Prepare yourselves and sit calmly. Anyone who dares cause trouble will be punished severely, he declared before tossing something into the air, a kind of star-shaped symbol. That and the star wheel were like iron and magnet, pulling toward each other before locking together. Click! A soft clicking sound echoed from the star wheel. Hearing that clicking sound, Richard didn't even dare to blink. Buzz! Starlight burst out from the star wheel, shining so brightly that it outshone the sun, turning day into what looked like a radiant night. The starlight only covered the area around the governor's castle. As it touched him, Richard could feel the overwhelming presence of ether surrounding him. He didn't even need to close his eyes to connect with it. Even while moving, he could absorb it. Of course, for him, the only ether worth focusing on was Tier 3. He had no need to care about the rest. At this moment, everyone began absorbing the ether they could sense. Richard focused on Tier 3 ether, and indeed, it was far easier. Though it still required a process, it didn't take long. Richard could absorb 1 unit of ether in less than a minute. He glanced at Ren as he did so, because he could truly absorb ether without even closing his eyes. The results would be the same. But unlike him, Ren had shut his eyes, looking utterly focused and serious. Grace's influence shouldn't be that significant. It's only Ren who affects me. If he weren't here, I should be able to absorb Tier 3 ether even faster, he thought. This was already common knowledge. In one area, or even in an entire city, the fewer people absorbing ether, the faster one could draw it in, like during the daytime. On the other hand, the more people absorbing ether at the same time, the slower one's absorption would be, as the ether was being contested and pulled in different directions. No one complained about this, it was simply a law of nature. Still, Richard couldn't deny his dissatisfaction. His true competition for ether was essentially only one person, Ren. If the man were just anyone else, unrelated to him, Richard might have kept silent. But this was his clear enemy. Richard felt he would be ashamed of himself if he couldn't eliminate Ren from the competition. He didn't think long before making a decision. He launched a mind attack at him. Their distance wasn't too close, but neither was it too far. In less than an instant, the mind attack struck Ren's mind. His eyes suddenly snapped open, shock and fear flashing within them. What is this? He staggered to his feet, clutching his head with both hands, as if struck by a sudden, searing headache. Chaotic, explosive energy burst from his body, scattering much of the ether within him. Though his voice was faint, how could others fail to sense the chaos in his aura? What's happening to him? Richard heard someone nearby mutter. Right after that question, something strange emerged from Ren's body, transparent, ghost-like figures one after another. Some of them tried to attack Ren's body, but being incorporeal, they couldn't touch him. Even so, Ren's condition grew increasingly unstable. "Ah!" He suddenly screamed, clutching his head as he fell to the ground, rolling in agony, as though the attacks of those figures were striking directly at his soul. Boom! Boom! Ether exploded from Ren's body one after another, leaving wounds across him. No, his ether will can't control the ether inside his body. Someone cried out upon seeing the violent eruptions. Without ether will, a person should normally be fine. But for Magi in the ethereal realm who had over 1,000 ether within their bodies, the loss of their ether will meant some of their ether could explode uncontrollably. Even Richard, the instigator, was stunned. A mind attack shouldn't have had such an effect on Ren. He should have been able to split his focus, resisting the mind attack while still cultivating, though of course it would have been difficult with his concentration divided. And though he did resist the mind attack from overwhelming his mind, his power seemed to spiral into utter chaos. Ren has been toying with human souls to create sinister tricks, using them to aid his cultivation and reach Tier 3 ether. Rumor has it, there's a wicked artifact inside him imprisoning countless souls. Now, it seems he's lost control of those souls, throwing everything into disorder, an old magus not far from Richard remarked. Richard turned his gaze toward him, listening intently to his words. A young magus beside the old one asked, but hasn't he been fine all this time, even if people said his power wasn't fully stable? Why is his strength unraveling now? I don't know, maybe something happened. There are always huge risks in taking extreme measures. We can't predict the exact cause, the old magus replied. Whoosh! The governor suddenly appeared at Ren's side. He didn't just appear, his power radiated outward, forming a cubic barrier that enveloped Ren. The instant the governor appeared next to him, Richard withdrew his mind attack, fearing the man would detect it if it collided with his power. But even though Richard stopped the mind attack, Ren's condition didn't stabilize. The chaos stemmed from his own power, mind attack was only the trigger. The governor's power enveloped Ren completely, suppressing him until everything in his body froze. Whoosh! The governor carried Ren away, vanishing in an instant. Perhaps Ren's problem was far more serious than it appeared, requiring immediate and dire assistance. With Ren gone, Richard was stunned as he felt the Tier 3 ether from the star will surging toward him, nearly tenfold, when he tried to absorb it. His eyes shone brightly when he felt that, making him instantly stop thinking about Ren. The man could only blame himself for relying on something bad to gain power that he shouldn't be able to get. I should absorb as much as possible, he thought. He was quite aware that in time, this ether from the star wheel would eventually merge back into nature. That was why he could not waste time. Now, it didn't just take him less than a minute to absorb one ether. In that time, his ether increased by 10. Of course, the ether bottle also filled up and in a short time, it became full. Ha ha. Richard could barely hold back his laughter. In just about 10 minutes, this was what he had gathered, and he hadn't even drunk from the ether bottle yet. He glanced at Grace, and it seemed she hadn't gained much improvement since Ren's departure. Perhaps she needed 10 whole minutes just to absorb a single Tier 3 ether. Of course, that amount was still quite significant for her. I need to be faster, Richard thought. He feared Ren would recover quickly and return. After all, his father would not want his son to miss this opportunity, and he would pay any price to heal Ren as fast as possible. This chance was the stepping stone to the next realm. If Ren failed to advance, it would be difficult for him to compete with the participants heading to the capital, since most of them would practically be in the life ether realm by then. Richard scanned the surroundings before settling on a corner filled with trees. He would continue there, relying on the ether bottle as well. Once he arrived, he immediately drank the ether stored inside the bottle. Ether, 660/10,000, Tier 3, plus 100. Ether accumulation, 4660, Tier 3. In an instant, his ether rose by another 100. This meant that every 10 minutes, he could gather 200 ether. In just over 2 hours, I should be able to absorb all the Tier 3 ether, he thought, growing more serious. The only question now was, could Ren return within that time? Richard was confident he would need longer to recover. Despite the earlier uproar caused by Ren, the atmosphere was now calm as everyone focused on training. Ether, 3260/10,000, Tier 3, plus 2,600. Ether accumulation, 7260, Tier 3. In just over 2 hours, Richard managed to gather 2,600 ether. In total, he had obtained 2,800 out of the 3,000 Tier 3 ether available. But now he realized that absorbing them wasn't as easy as before. Not only had some been absorbed by Grace, but the remainder seemed to be merging with the natural world. Absorbing them required extra effort. Still, Richard was satisfied with his current results. Others, of course, could never be as fast as him. They were still calmly cultivating. Oh, his face showed sudden interest. At this moment, Grace suddenly released a stronger pressure, making those nearby struggle to breathe. Did he advance? Richard wondered. Gray, who had kept his eyes shut, suddenly opened them. He seemed to be suppressing his power to prevent it from bursting out, since that would disturb everyone else who was cultivating. Whoosh! He stood up and quickly ran out of the area, crossing the river that bordered it. Laura and the others watched him in awe. This advancement meant he was now a whole level above them. Naturally, they were uncertain when they would ever catch up, even Laura, whose talent was second only to his. Gray is now stronger than Ren. We don't even know if Ren can advance today, someone remarked. He should be able to. All he needs is perhaps around 1,500 more ether. With no competition, it won't be hard for him to advance. But can he return and continue cultivating? It's already been over 2 hours. In another 2, all the ether will likely be gone. The governor will surely do everything possible. Oh, look, he's already back. Indeed, the governor reappeared, bringing Ren with him. Though Ren looked pale as death, it was clear he could still cultivate again. Sigh, having a powerful father is truly a blessing, someone muttered upon seeing Ren. Richard had hoped he wouldn't return, but he still had. Hurry! The governor's expression was grim. He ordered Ren to resume cultivating at once. Of course, Ren's expression was far worse. He sat down and closed his eyes. This time, the governor stood right beside him, clearly unwilling to risk the same incident happening again. He obviously suspected someone was behind it. But Ren only shut his eyes for a moment before reopening them, his gaze filled with confusion and disbelief. What's wrong? The governor asked. Ren didn't answer immediately. He closed his eyes again, as if trying to focus. But like before, he soon opened them once more. This time, his confusion had turned into shock. Father, there's almost no Tier 3 ether left in the star wheel. Only a little remains, and it's already difficult to absorb, Ren said awkwardly. The governor's face showed deep astonishment. But he couldn't confirm it himself. The star wheel was no simple artifact. It had the ability to detect anyone above the ether wheel realm attempting to connect with the ether it released. If that happened, the star wheel would immediately withdraw all of its ether. The governor's gaze unconsciously shifted to Grace, who was watching calmly like everyone else. Naturally, he assumed she was the one who had consumed the Tier 3 ether, since, as far as he knew, Grace was the only one besides his son who possessed Tier 3 ether. But the truth was far from that. Richard merely observed quietly, thinking, this Ren doesn't seem very bright. The man's confusion made Richard feel he wasn't suspected in the slightest. Perhaps, like Damon, he believed Richard only possessed Tier 1 ether. Richard chose to continue pretending to cultivate. He naturally preferred no trouble at all. As for Ren, let him remain confused like a fool. Soon, the governor approached Grace. Miss Grace, were you the one who absorbed all the Tier 3 ether? He asked politely. He was filled with courtesy toward her. But Grace suddenly stood. Can't you see I haven't even reached the ethereal realm? She replied, completely disregarding his politeness. With that, Grace turned and walked away. She seemed uninterested in continuing cultivation, since with so little Tier 3 ether left, it was much harder for her to absorb. The governor was left frozen, watching Grace leave. Grace hadn't concealed her aura when she spoke, so it became obvious that she hadn't yet reached the ethereal realm. Those who understood what had happened exchanged strange looks. Most dared not speak, fearful that the governor or Ren might vent their anger on them. There must be someone else with Tier 3 ether, someone extremely talented. That person must have taken advantage of Ren's absence to absorb it all. Several who already had ether frameworks in their heads spoke through spiritual communication. That same person is likely the one who threw Ren's power into chaos. Yeah, truly a terrifying figure. It seems Ren has no chance of advancing to the life ether realm anytime soon. How will he even compete in the capital's tournament? He'll be the weakest one there. Ren still seemed caught between belief and disbelief. From time to time, he kept trying to absorb the ether. Unfortunately, no matter how many times he tried, the result remained the same. Richard noticed that people had already begun leaving since the Tier 1 ether was running out. Even though it was the most abundant, there were simply too many absorbing it, unlike the Tier 2 ether, where fewer people shared, so each one could gain more. Richard took this chance to leave together with the others. He felt much more at ease once he finally crossed the bridge. After that, he ran further away from the city center, not wanting to get involved in any more trouble. Although Ren didn't seem all that smart, it was possible he would later start speculating that Richard possessed Tier 3 ether. Once he was far enough from the city center, Richard finally felt at peace. Boy! Suddenly, he heard a voice he felt he had heard before. Looking toward the sound, he found Gray, sitting at a cafe that served only drinks, sipping coffee. Gray waved at him when he noticed him. Richard hadn't expected him to be this far already after his advancement. Curious why he was calling him, Richard approached with a cautious look. "What is it?" Richard asked when he arrived at the table where Gray was sitting. "Sit down, have a drink with me. I don't think just apologizing is enough for my mistake of abducting you. I should at least treat you as well," Gray replied in a tone that sounded as though he was in a very good mood. "Boss, get the boy a cup of coffee," he said to the cafe owner before turning his gaze back to Richard. "The coffee in this place isn't ordinary. It's imported from another continent and has the effect of refreshing the mind, making it easier for magi to increase their mastery of codex and arcane arts. 1 cup costs 15 nature spirits." Oh, Richard was a little surprised when he saw a cup placed before him. But he was even more surprised by Gray's behavior. For a genius who was nearly the champion of 3 provinces, he seemed far too kind, and Richard didn't sense any ulterior motive in his gaze. Like a protagonist with a hero's heart who always stands on the side of justice, he thought. But clearly, he betrayed his own hearts by submitting to Ren. "By the way, why were you running? Was someone chasing you?" Gray asked as Richard began sipping the coffee and feeling its effect, which indeed made his mind relax and settle. Richard shook his head and replied, "It's nothing. But I'm still curious, what exactly did Ren give you that made you decide to yield to him?" When asked this, Gray's expression twisted into 2 at once, smiling, yet disappointed. He stirred his coffee with a spoon before finally chuckling. "Something of great value, and it just happened to suit me very well. If I continued on to the capital, my chances of winning first place there were too slim, and I wasn't even confident of making the top 5. So it was better for me to accept what Ren offered," he said. "Even if that means angering your girlfriend?" Richard pressed further. "Kid, let me tell you, in this world, strength matters far more. If I can become much stronger, I can stay with Laura without anyone daring to disturb us," Gray replied in a tone like he was teaching a child an important lesson about the world. Richard laughed when he heard this. "Don't think I'm uneducated. I've heard that line too many times already. But I thought you were a man of resolve, a man full of honor. And yet, you sold your honor for something. Do you even know how many people suffered because of your decision? Those who supported you, those who bet on you, they all took losses without even seeing a shred of fight from you," he said with a mocking tone, instantly souring Gray's expression. Though he was the type of man who appeared friendly, he still looked like he wanted to snap at those words. However, he likely realized it wasn't appropriate to lash out at a boy who was still far too young. Besides, he was somewhat shocked to hear a child say something like this to him. Just as he was about to speak in reply, Richard cut him off. "Don't tell me I'm too young and don't understand how the world works, or that I don't realize things aren't so simple. To me, your decision wasn't exactly wrong, but you should stop acting like you're a man of honor." At that, Gray's face twitched, turning very ugly. It was as if he was enduring a shame he had never felt before. "Do you think I was wrong?" he asked, suddenly wanting to hear more from Richard. He looked uncomfortable, as though acting like a hypocrite bothered him greatly. "You were wrong." Richard nodded. "But every mistake can still be corrected." He smiled faintly as he said that. "By the way, you probably don't know Ren doesn't seem likely to advance to the life ether realm anytime soon. He's returned, but somehow the Tier 3 ether from the star wheel is nearly gone," he added. "How's that possible? Who consumed it all?" Gray was deeply shocked to hear this. Richard shrugged and shook his head. "People are already talking about how he could represent our 3 provinces with only ethereal realm strength. At this rate, he might lose to an opponent's mere glare, turning our provinces into a laughingstock." "That is indeed terrible." Gray nodded with furrowed brows. "That's why you shouldn't have given up. Look at the result of your mistake. It's worse than you even know." Gray's expression was immediately filled with guilt upon hearing that. What Richard didn't know was that if the representatives of the 3 provinces ended up at the bottom ranks, the kingdom would likely cut significant funding and resources from the provinces. This could cause a decline in the living standards of their citizens. After brooding for quite some time, Gray suddenly stood up. "Boss, here's the payment." "I'm heading out," he said, leaving nature's spirits on the table. What is he going to do? Richard wondered, giving him a strange look as he suddenly left. Not that he expected anything. He had simply spoken what he felt needed to be said. Richard kept drinking his coffee and felt comfortable relaxing in the restaurant, occasionally sensing the power within his body that he felt had grown too vast, having already accumulated over 7,000 ether. "I think I need a battle," he thought. "Richard, come back." Just as he was thinking that, he suddenly heard Lilith's voice directly in his head, making him instinctively glance around, though he couldn't find her. But he quickly realized that the woman must have been calling him from her house. Her sixth sense clearly reached a long distance. Richard wasn't sure why she was calling him. Curiosity drove him to return quickly. Entering Lilith's home, he immediately found the woman sitting in the living room, waving at him with a faint smile. "Is there something, Sister Lilith?" Richard asked softly as he sat down across from her. "Still pretending, are you? Do you know the governor came to me asking for help to heal his son? You attacked him with mind attack and then drained all the Tier 3 ether from the star wheel," Lilith replied. After saying that, she suddenly stood up, bent over in front of Richard to bring her face closer to his, her hand pinching his cheek and holding it firmly in place. Her unblinking eyes stared straight into his face. Richard was stunned, his face flushing red as he felt Lilith's fragrant breath. Seeing her face from such a close distance, he could not deny her beauty. No makeup or skincare, yet her skin was so pale and flawless, while the shape of her face was utterly enchanting. Her slightly moist red lips were alluring, throwing his mind into disarray. "I have to admit, I'm curious. What exactly are you? Are you really just a human boy?" Lilith asked. Richard was left speechless. Fortunately, Lilith returned to her seat after saying that. It seemed she was simply confirming that he truly was human. Richard let out a sigh of relief. "Sister Lilith, I only just mastered it and tried it on Ren." Unexpectedly, he became that chaotic, he explained. Ren's weakness lies in his mind because he relies too much on human souls. "That is the flaw of taking shortcuts in cultivation," Lilith replied. "But don't think too much about it. With your talent, even training normally is easier for you than using those extreme methods. Now, use mind attack on me. I'm fairly confident I can master it once I experience it myself." Her words made Richard glance at her and clear his throat, not immediately doing as she asked. Lilith rolled her eyes at that. Boy, I know you have many demands. Tell me. Don't worry about the ether skeleton in the body parts. I will make sure you get it, she said. Hearing that, Richard grinned widely. You are truly kind and generous, Sister Lilith, Richard replied softly. For a moment, Lilith's face twitched, realizing Richard was about to exploit the opportunity. Remember, Richard, you have already benefited greatly by receiving such an extraordinary arcane art from me, Lilith reminded him. I know. Richard still smiled. Sister, I want a phantom cloak, and it must be the kind that enlarges my body, not shrinks to fit me, so that when I wear it, I don't look like a little child, Richard said. He knew phantom cloaks had two types, and the one he was asking for was the superior kind since it could alter the wearer's physique. This was a much better disguise tool, usually called a Tier 2 phantom cloak. Lilith nodded at his request, taking out a white cloak. This one is even better. It can change colors as you wish, she said. If it could change colors, then it was a Tier 3 phantom cloak. Richard quickly grabbed it and stored it away. Sister, I also want a strong weapon since I don't have one yet. I hope it's a Tier 3 weapon, he added. Tiers were essentially determined by their creators. Tier 1 was forged by Magi in the Ethereal realm, Tier 2 by Magi in the Life Ether realm, and Tier 3 by those beyond. Each tier naturally held significant differences in power. However, even higher-tier weapons could still be used by weaker Magi. They simply couldn't maximize the weapon's strength, though the power released would still be extraordinary. In his view, this was something Lilith could provide, as long as he didn't ask for a Tier 4 weapon. I will give it to you along with the ether skeleton later, Lilith nodded. Also, the next request will be your last, she added firmly. But I need 2 more things, Richard replied without hesitation. You. Lilith's face instantly turned red. Sister, this is only fair for what you're receiving. I will truly use mind attack on you whenever you want me to. Once you master it, how much stronger will you become? Opponents who were once your equals will surely fall easily to you, Richard said. This is only my guess. I might still fail to master mind attack, Lilith replied. You definitely can. I believe in you, Richard said, giving her an encouraging smile, leaving Lilith no choice but to roll her eyes. Fine, but only 2 more things, no more, she said. Don't worry, I won't change my mind, Richard replied. What are they? Lilith asked. 10,000 nature spirits and something that can give me another 1,000 ether, Richard said. Do you know the star wheel is the only thing in this province that can quickly increase ether? There's nothing else, Lilith replied, frowning. That last request clearly hit her nerves. But Richard stayed silent. He said nothing, but his gaze made it clear that was the only thing he wanted. You. Her annoyance grew at his silence. If Richard were truly just a child, he might have reconsidered his demand. But he was certain Lilith could obtain it. She not only possessed talent and strength, but also the most extraordinary background in the kingdom. Take this first. Lilith finally gave in when Richard stayed silent. She directly transferred 10,000 nature spirits into Richard's ring. That amount might not have been much in her eyes. Can you use mind attack on me first? She asked. Not until I get my items, Richard replied. This time, Lilith began panting softly. Both her cheeks flushed red, yet the sight was enough to make any man lose his mind. Humph. Lilith snorted before standing up, clearly in a very foul mood. She left in a hurry. Even if she was angry, Richard didn't care. To him, this was truly a fair trade, because once Lilith mastered mind attack, even if only at 1%, she would become tremendously powerful. Who knew? Once she broke through the first threshold, she might advance even further. Richard was left alone in the house, and he couldn't help but wonder again where Sister Lisa was, since she still hadn't returned. Unfortunately, he had no information about her destination. He rose from his seat and put on the phantom cloak Lilith had given him. It was large, but astonishingly, it instantly altered his appearance. His body hadn't actually changed, but the cloak created a false layer over him that felt completely real. With just a thought, the cloak shifted from white to black. Richard was satisfied with the result. He even discovered that his voice could be altered into that of an older man. He quickly left Lilith's house. There was one thing he wanted to do: sell the Cimera soil, or more precisely, exchange it for something of equal value, because he really didn't need that and had no interest in magic plant cultivation. He wanted it to be replaced with something useful for combat. The Night Valley city naturally had entire districts filled with magic shops. In fact, every magic shop in this city was quite large. The most eye-catching one bore the emblem of a black moon, Moonshadow Magic Shop, a business owned by the Moonshadow clan, said to have branches all across the kingdom. Richard noticed most people chose that shop because it was widely known to trade honestly. Despite his feelings toward the clan, Richard still decided to enter that shop. Like most magic shops, the place was dominated by books and weapons. The difference was, they sold far more sky armors in various designs. Many items were so striking that Richard's eyes lit up. However, when it came to Tier 3 weapons, he only saw 3 of them. He approached a large display case filled with mysterious-looking objects, various kinds of artifacts. All were neatly arranged, with the best placed at the very top. Naturally, Richard was drawn to the best item there, a single gold coin. He had no idea what it was, but for some reason, his fire and lightning elements seemed to resonate with it. Richard waved over a shop attendant. "What is this coin?" he asked. "Sir, this is called the Ignis Volt Core, an artifact that can absorb fire and lightning, then release them as high-speed laser blasts capable of long-range attacks and piercing through anything," the attendant explained. "Really?" Richard was somewhat surprised. "Then how much fire and lightning can this artifact hold?" Richard asked again. He was deeply intrigued by the coin, but the most important detail was, of course, its capacity. If it couldn't store a vast amount of fire and lightning, it would only be of limited use to him. "It can hold an enormous amount, sir." This item was personally discovered by Lady Rebecca. Lady Rebecca said the Ignis Volt Core was very useful even for a magus of her level. Unfortunately, she only has lightning power, not fire, so she couldn't maximize the artifact's potential. That's why she placed it here, hoping to exchange it for something else. Oh, Richard hadn't expected that his mother was the one who found it. "So this item can only be exchanged for another?" he asked. "Yes, something of equal value. Of course, we don't accept just anything, only what our shop deems desirable." "What about Cimera soil? Would you accept that?" "Cimera soil?" The attendant was shocked. "Yes, we would accept it." "Please wait while I inform the manager," he said, hurrying upstairs. Richard had only asked and hadn't even said he wanted to exchange yet, but the attendant was already calling for the manager. Still, Richard decided to wait. Not long after, he saw the attendant return with a neatly groomed blonde, middle-aged man who looked friendly. The man briskly walked toward Richard. He observed the cloaked figure for a moment before asking, "Do you truly wish to exchange Cimera soil for the Ignis Volt Core?" "Yes, if you had 20,000 nature spirits," Richard replied. Cimera soil could enhance one's affinity with the earth element, even helping it reach 90%. But that wasn't its only use. It could also be cultivated with magical plants. Richard felt its value was still higher, not equal to just the Ignis Volt Core. The manager hesitated upon hearing those words. "Sir, that's too much," he said. "If you agree, we can trade. If not, then there's no need," Richard answered firmly. The other party clearly wanted the Cimera soil. How could he not demand more? The manager fell into deep thought, weighing the pros and cons. 20,000 nature spirits was certainly no small amount. But even if they spent all their nature spirits, it was nearly impossible to buy Cimera soil elsewhere. The item was extremely useful for resource cultivation, something the clan would naturally keep for themselves. It wasn't that the clan didn't already own some, but with an additional Cimera soil, they could expand their magical plant cultivation significantly. "You must decide quickly, or I'll leave," Richard said again, taking a step away. All right, very well." The manager quickly relented, afraid Richard would walk away. "May I see the Cimera soil?" the manager asked. Casually, Richard brought out the object, a plate-like piece made of earth. It immediately drew the attention of other customers. But inside the shop, there was no way anyone would dare to rob him. The manager's eyes lit up at the sight. He then retrieved the gold coin from the display and produced a large pouch. "Sir, here are 20,000 nature spirits," the manager said. Richard took the pouch and the golden coin at once, then handed the Cimera soil to the manager. The latter promptly left after securing it. Richard observed the coin known as the Ignis Volt Core. When he held it, it felt as though it was trying to siphon his ether, demanding that he convert it into fire and lightning. Time for a fight, he thought. Richard quickly left the shop, blending into the crowd, all of whom were also wearing phantom robes. Others watching him would not find it easy to recognize him. He even changed the robe's color to brown and shrank his body slightly. In this city, there was a gate that connected directly to a vast forest. Even the walls surrounding the gate were much taller. The reason was obvious. The forest was filled with too many ferocious beasts. Many of them were even primordial beasts. Even if they weren't of the king variety, they could still grow into higher tiers. The gate was heavily guarded by sky armor knights, but they didn't forbid anyone from leaving through it. Of course, only a few were brave enough. Richard passed through the gate, entering the forest where the towering trees loomed above. He immediately felt the forest's oppressive atmosphere, as though countless feral eyes were watching him with killing intent. Most importantly, the forest was rather dark. The trees were so dense that sunlight barely filtered through. Richard pressed forward, hoping something would appear soon, as he was eager to test how strong he had truly become. Before long, a beast appeared, a black wolf, even taller than a grown man. It stood about 2.5 meters tall, with fur bristling like spikes. Its red eyes locked onto Richard with bloodlust. "This should be a Tier 5 beast," he murmured. Among beasts, Tier 5 was the highest. Only if they awakened their primordial bloodline to become a primordial beast could they advance further. Whoosh! The black wolf lunged at Richard without a sound. Though the distance between them wasn't small, the wolf moved with incredible speed. Richard didn't have enough time to use the Ignis Volt Core. But he had another way. Before him appeared a shadow wolf, even larger than the real one. His 100 shadow monster ability allowed him to shape shadow beasts of his choice. Since the enemy was a wolf, he conjured a wolf. One was enough. More importantly, it wasn't just a simple shadow beast. Whoosh! The shadow wolf leaped toward the black wolf, clashing as the two beasts bit and grappled, rolling across the ground. Richard didn't see his shadow wolf losing, but he couldn't afford to wait. Snap! He flicked his fingers. Boom! Suddenly, the shadow wolf erupted, unleashing an explosion of lightning and darkness that formed a sphere of crackling shadow, swallowing the black wolf whole. Boom! From within the blast came another, even stronger detonation, scattering bloody chunks in every direction. Richard had fused the shadow wolf with his lighting of darkness arcane art. That arcane art could be applied in many ways, but the simplest was to merge it with a shadow beast and detonate it once the beast restrained the enemy. Tier 5 is no match for me, Richard said before moving on. He didn't only watch ahead, but also above, anticipating beasts that lurked in trees, like monkeys. But instead of monkeys, he spotted a green serpent blending seamlessly with the leaves. It was massive, as thick as a human body and of unknown length. Its scales bore dark green stripes that seemed to glow faintly. This one is clearly a primordial beast. Richard didn't hesitate. He could feel the aura unique to primordial beasts radiating from it. Though the distance between them was great, the serpent sensed his presence the moment he looked at it. It stared back coldly, flicking its black tongue. Richard didn't wait for it to move. He aimed the Ignis Volt Core, pinching the golden coin between two fingers. From each finger, fire and lightning surged into the coin. The glow was so blinding that anyone who looked would surely be struck with searing pain in their eyes. Richard released massive streams of fire and lightning, but they didn't scatter. The Ignis Volt Core absorbed them too quickly. Once he felt it was enough, he stopped. At the front of the coin, a tiny flame coated in lightning formed. Whiz! It shot forth, becoming a laser beam that stretched with unimaginable speed, so fast that even Richard's eyes couldn't follow. In the blink of an eye, The beam pierced the serpent's head and continued through multiple trees, disappearing far in the distance. More astonishingly, the space along its path seemed torn apart, releasing trails of scalding smoke. And yet, the Ignis Volt core itself showed no signs of heat or smoke. This feels like a bow attack, firing at a single distant point, but far more terrifying, fueled by fire and lightning. Richard was very satisfied with the result. The amount of fire and lightning he used wasn't much, yet the Ignis Volt core wielded it flawlessly, wasting nothing. Bang! The green serpent suddenly fell, clearly dead as its vital head was cleanly pierced. Even though it was a primordial beast and its corpse could be sold, Richard wasn't interested. The price was far too low for his standards. He preferred to push deeper into the forest. Paul, are you sure about what you saw? Yes, young master, I truly saw the dark black rose. But unfortunately, it was guarded by many giant bats. I ran before they could notice me. Richard suddenly heard the voices of two men beyond a large tree ahead. He quickly hid and peeked at the source of the voices, spotting four figures, a chubby young man, a skinny young man, and two towering sky armor knights. The chubby one was Jack Moonshadow, son of the clan leader. Richard hadn't expected to see him here, but what he said piqued his interest. The dark black rose. He had heard of it before, something said to aid in mastering codexes and arcane arts. At the very least, for codexes and arcane arts already mastered to 1%, using the dark black rose could raise mastery by several more percent. Naturally, it was something of immense value. Are those bats ordinary beasts or primordial beasts? Jack asked. The smallest one I saw was about 4 meters long, Paul replied. Damn, then they must all be primordial beasts. How big was the largest? About 8 meters long, and there were quite a few of them. They're at tier 8. We can't fight them. Young master, why don't we just report this to the clan? Paul suggested. Idiot. If the clan finds out, will they still give it to us? Of course not. It'll be handed to that little slut, Grace, Jack snapped irritably. Paul fell silent, scratching his head, as if wondering what solution remained. But before Jack could say anything further, Richard, who had been watching the four of them, unleashed a mind attack on 3 of them, everyone except Paul. With his mastery still only at 3%, he could only attack 3 targets. In an instant, their eyes bulged before turning vacant. Richard had expected this. The 3 of them, especially Jack, were far too weak to resist his mind attack. Jack seemed to have less than 2,000 ether accumulation. The 2 Sky Armor Knights might have been strong in terms of raw strength, but they had no way to defend against a strike aimed directly at their minds. Their armor could only release power outward, not channel it inward. After the mind attack struck, Richard immediately knocked them unconscious, shocking Paul so much that he leapt backward. But before he could process what was happening, the mind attack struck him too. In truth, he was slightly stronger than Jack and managed to resist for a moment, but only for a moment, before Richard's attack took over his mind. Richard did not knock Paul unconscious. Instead, he walked toward him. Tell me where the dark black rose is, Richard demanded. At the 3 o'clock direction. Keep going until you find a river. It's right across from that river, Paul answered immediately, his mind controlled by the attack. Richard gave a slight nod, then made him collapse as well before heading off on his own. Even for him, the dark black rose was something worth fighting for. The trees in the 3 o'clock direction were thick and overgrown. Richard could only pass through narrow paths that were sometimes blocked by branches, forcing him to leap over them. Fortunately, the forest Paul had mentioned wasn't too far. Soon, Richard saw a river about 10 meters wide, filled with massive rocks and rushing with a violent current. Across the river lay a grassy hill swarming with bats. Just as Paul had described, they ranged from 4 to 8 meters in size. What made them truly terrifying was their overwhelming number. The sky above the hill looked pitch black, completely blanketed by the creatures. On that hill, Richard spotted many rose stalks, but only one bore a black blossom. The rest were red. That single black rose emitted a faint, endless stream of black smoke, a clear sign it was the dark black rose, not just an ordinary black flower. It'll still be troublesome if I have to fight those bats, Richard thought. Even though he was confident in his strength, their sheer numbers made him worry that he might actually lose. But what if I roar, he wondered, recalling his experience in the Forest of Darkness. His roar had not only killed beasts before, but also driven them away in terror, leaving him completely unchallenged. The moment the idea struck, he didn't hesitate. Roar. He unleashed a thunderous roar, many times louder than the last time. The air itself trembled, and the river surged as the sound waves crashed across it. Richard had no idea how far his roar carried, but he saw the bats trembling uncontrollably, several dropping dead on the spot. The ones that survived frantically flapped their wings, desperate to escape. Even more astonishing, countless beasts from around the area fled their hiding spots, running as fast as they could to get away from him. Among them was a lion, nearly 6 meters tall, with a massive mane encircling its face. Despite its ferocious appearance, even it bolted in fear. Richard could only stare with a strange expression. The sky above the grassy hill, once darkened by countless bats, was now clear. He couldn't understand how his roar could terrify beasts to this extent, unless dragons truly had the power to instill such primal fear. Not dwelling on it, Richard leapt across the river, hopping from rock to rock until he reached the other side. Luckily, it wasn't a very wide river. Once across, he sprinted toward the grassy hill. He trampled over the red roses surrounding the dark black rose until he stood directly before it. Faintly, he caught a smell reminiscent of burnt charcoal wafting from the black smoke it emitted. As far as he knew, the rose needed to be burned and its smoke inhaled to unleash its effects. Richard cut it from its stalk and stored it inside his storage artifact. After glancing around once more, he turned back toward the forest. With the black rose in hand, all he wanted was to return home and cultivate. Besides, he doubted he'd encounter any other beasts after that roar. In no time, he returned to where Jack and his companions still lay unconscious. Richard couldn't be bothered with them and moved on. Soon after, he was back in the city. He slipped into a narrow alley to remove his phantom cloak, restoring his appearance as a 7-year-old boy. Walking briskly through the streets, he suddenly caught snippets of conversation among the crowd. "Did you hear? Gray demanded to represent our 3 provinces, saying Ren is unfit. He even challenged Ren to a fight, but Ren didn't dare show himself. Can a participant even be replaced after Gray openly admitted defeat? Besides, he already accepted compensation from Ren. Did he return it? Who knows? But apparently, he's seeking support from influential figures. They might back him since it's practically impossible for Ren to reach the life ether realm before the tournament in the capital begins." Richard could only say that Gray was far too reckless, trying to seize Ren's position after already admitting defeat. Still, that wasn't his business. Night had fallen by the time he returned to Lilith's empty home. There was no one there but himself. He sat in his room, preparing a plate to place the dark black rose upon. This was something he intended to use, and of course, he would use it right away. However, Richard did not use his own flames to burn the rose, afraid it might be reduced to ashes in an instant. Instead, he lit a candle and burned only a small portion of the flower. Buzz. The rose immediately ignited, producing an extremely thick black smoke, and it burned quickly, making the smoke even denser. Although Richard had no experience inhaling smoke directly, aside from cigarettes, he did not hesitate to draw it in, channeling ether into his nose so his ability to inhale it was multiplied many times over. The black smoke surged into his nostrils, making his eyes widen as the overwhelming sensation filled him, utterly unbearable. But at the same time, he immediately felt something else, as if his mind was being sharpened several times over. Even his consciousness was affected, as though dragged into an illusionary world where his vision shifted between endless light, boundless darkness, and terrifying storms. Yet to him, those visions were meaningless. His mind was entirely focused only on one thing, the Codex of Dragon Emperor. This was not his choice. The rose's smoke seemed to guide him, steering his focus toward the strongest of all his codices and arcane arts. Of course, he didn't care which one advanced. They were all parts of himself. Any progress was cause for joy. With his sharpened mind, thanks to the black heart soul, combined with the effects of the dark black rose, mysteries of the Codex of Dragon Emperor that had once baffled him became clear with ease. As he unraveled those mysteries, his mastery of the Codex gradually increased. He couldn't determine exactly how much he improved, but he knew this was no short training. Nor could he predict the results until it was over. Given the reputation of the dark black rose, the outcome surely wouldn't be disappointing. But Richard wasn't aware of when he stopped. When everything was over, he simply fell into a deep sleep. And in his sleep, he received a notification. Your mastery of mind attack has increased from 3% to 13%. Mind attack, 13%. Richard snapped awake as soon as he received the notification, startled, because the system had only increased his mastery of mind attack. At 13%, it meant he could now strike 13 people simultaneously with mind attack. Remembering his use of the dark black rose the previous night, he immediately checked the Codex of Dragon Emperor's data. Naturally, there was no notification, only an update to the data itself, since this was pure progress without the system's aid. Codex of Dragon Emperor, 40%. What? Richard was stunned when he saw the number had reached 40%. He clearly remembered it had been only 31% before. Now it was 40, an increase of 9%. Amazing! He couldn't be happier. Looking toward the window, he realized the sky was already bright. It was well past noon. Richard quickly stood, but the house was still empty. There was no one else but him. Sister Lisa was nowhere to be found, and he couldn't guess when Lilith would return. Since Richard's requests had been rather excessive, it was likely Lilith wouldn't be back anytime soon. Not wanting to dwell on bothersome thoughts, he went to bathe first. Unexpectedly, someone knocked at the door just after he finished. Peeking through the window, he saw that it was Grace, accompanied by her maid. Richard hesitated, but still opened the door. The two girls were slightly surprised to see him appear. "Where is Princess Lilith?" Grace asked. "She's not here." "She went out," Richard replied. "When will she return?" the girl pressed. "How should I know?" Richard felt a little irritated answering, since the girl's tone sounded more like an interrogation. He thought, no surprise, she was raised by that madwoman who abandoned her own child just to protect her reputation. Richard stared at Grace, wondering what else she would say. But she only furrowed her brows. "Miss, perhaps Princess Lilith is busy. Let's come again tomorrow," her maid suggested. Instead of agreeing, the girl, still staring at Richard, suddenly said, "How about you have lunch with me?" "What?" The maid was stunned, and Richard himself hadn't expected such words from her. He studied her and realized she was serious. But was he interested? Not at all. He had an adult's mentality. How could he be interested in having lunch with a 7-year-old girl? Only if she were grown would he be interested. Now? Absolutely not. Richard shook his head. "No, thank you. I'm busy," he said. His refusal clearly caught Grace off guard. She frowned, giving him a sharp glare. Yet Richard's face remained utterly expressionless. Then, without another word, she suddenly turned and left. She looked annoyed. Richard shook his head, but then suddenly noticed a crow flying swiftly toward the door. Whoosh! The crow spun around at the doorway and dropped a ring. "I haven't found anything to increase your 1,000 ether yet, but the other 2 items are inside that ring." Lilith's voice echoed from the departing crow. Richard scowled slightly, disappointed he hadn't received everything. Checking inside the ring, he indeed found a torso bone and a golden sword adorned with engravings of an eagle and a wolf. "Well, let's fuse this bone first," he said, returning to his room. This was the final piece of his ether skeleton. After this, it would be complete. Next, all he needed was to gather 10,000 ether, and he could advance to the next realm. Drawing out the torso bone, Richard immediately absorbed it into his body. The process was effortless, completed in an instant, since his skeleton was already dominated by the ether skeleton. Ding! Your torso bone has merged with the ether skeleton. Ether accumulation plus 1,000. Ether 3260/10,000 Tier 3. Ether accumulation, 8260 Tier 3. Having a complete ether bones, Richard also felt a sort of transformation within his body. It was clear that his strength had increased in a particular way. Crack. Richard stretched his body, and his bones creaked loudly. Remarkable, he thought. He stood up and stepped forward, feeling as though he could leap 50 meters high. He hurriedly stepped out of his room, spotting Sister Lisa, whom he had been waiting for a long time, finally return. But she appeared so rushed, entering Lilith's house while constantly glancing behind her, as if worried someone was following. When she saw Richard, she froze for a moment before letting out a sigh of relief. "Richard, let's go home," she said, leaving Richard stunned. "Sister Lisa, why must we go home now?" "I'm still waiting for one more gift from Lilith, and I need to use mind attack on her," Richard replied. In truth, he was quite happy staying in this big city. That was why he felt reluctant to leave so soon. He wanted to spend more time here. Of course, he was aware that Sister Lisa probably had a serious problem, but couldn't they solve it here? "You've already mastered mind attack?" Sister Lisa was slightly surprised, then shook her head. "Lilith can come to the dark black rose village later," she said. "Sister, what have you done?" Richard asked. "Don't ask now, let's just go," Sister Lisa answered. This time, she pulled Richard's hand, leaving him with no choice but to follow. She dragged him out of Lilith's house, even forgetting to close the door, then pulled him into the carriage before quickly rushing to the driver's seat. Whoosh! She tugged on Athena's reins, and the horse instantly shot forward. Richard could only roll his eyes, thinking that if they had stayed inside Lilith's house, they would have been far safer. Surely Sister Lisa knew this, but perhaps she didn't want Lilith's help in dealing with her personal problems. Since Lisa was in such a rush, Athena galloped quickly through the city streets, forcing the crowd to scatter aside as the reddish-black horse bolted past. Although many were angered, none could catch up. The horse stormed through the gates, still at full speed, drawing shouts from the guards. But once they were far away, there was nothing the guards could do. "Sister Lisa, what's happening?" Richard couldn't help but ask again. "This is your problem," Sister Lisa answered. "What?" Richard was stunned once more. Why had this suddenly become his problem? "You're the one who sees the Tier 3 ether from Ren, aren't you?" Sister Lisa asked, and Richard unconsciously nodded. Even though no one else knows, right now Ren is under heavy pressure since Gray wants to take his position. "What does that have to do with me?" Richard asked, confused. "Ren will resort to more extreme methods to advance. A mega skilled in alchemy, apparently the governor's mentor, has promised to help him. But this requires the sacrifice of a young genius with high affinity for multiple elements. At first, I thought this wouldn't involve you, since Ren shouldn't even know you. But I was wrong. Ren chose you as his target. Now that Lilith isn't at her house, and who knows when she'll return, Ren and the governor clearly no longer care about your relationship with her. They'll try to capture you now. Lilith's house won't be able to protect you. We can only run. I've already told my aunt about this, and she asked me to take you away first. She should be seeking help for us by now." "Where did you get this information, Sister Lisa?" Richard asked. "From a friend working at the governor's residence, though I'm still puzzled how Ren found out about you." Because of this, Richard explained how it had started, that he was the one who killed Damon, who intended to massacre the dark black Rose Village. No wonder. Lisa sighed helplessly. She couldn't blame Richard for this, since he had protected the village from annihilation. At this moment, Richard began to ponder. He was being hunted. If it were just Ren, he was ready to fight to the death. But what worried him was that Ren might bring someone even stronger. Returning to the village was indeed the better choice. At least there, his ancestor would surely have grown stronger by now. "Athena, run faster, show your true self." Richard spoke to Athena. Whoosh! Suddenly, Athena underwent a transformation. Her body grew larger, crimson light radiated from her, forming wings and crimson armor, denser, yet still made of light. When those light wings flapped, Athena's speed multiplied many times over, nearly throwing Richard out of the carriage. Athena was no longer merely running, she soared into the air, only to descend again. By the time she landed, she had already crossed more than 200 meters. Tier 5 or 6. Richard was in awe, not expecting Athena to have advanced this far after consuming the eggshell. With this speed, they could reach the dark black rose village in less than half a day. "Richard, your horse?" Sister Lisa asked in disbelief. But Richard stayed silent, giving no explanation. In a short time, they were already far from Night Valley City. Even so, Richard felt increasingly uneasy, sensing that someone was watching. Or perhaps, they had been watched ever since leaving Lilith's house. Unfortunately, the one targeting them was the provincial governor. Of course, escaping him completely was impossible. Still, if it was only surveillance to track their movements, Richard wasn't too concerned. What mattered was ensuring they couldn't be caught before reaching the dark black rose village. The journey continued, with Athena running as though she had limitless energy. As a horse, her strength seemed undivided, focused solely on her ability to run. Though Richard kept feeling watched along the way, no signs of an attack appeared. He grew more at ease and finally drew the golden sword given to him by Lilith. One side of the blade bore the carving of an eagle, the other a wolf. Endless golden light radiated from it, a clear testament to its power. Richard felt the power of the sword. It seemed to possess the ability to absorb all kinds of elements and then unleash slashes in the form of those very elements. "Richard, is this a gift from Lilith?" Lisa asked, astonished as she looked at the sword. "Yeah." Richard nodded with a faint smile. "What did you ask from her?" Lilith was curious. "Only 4 items," Richard replied casually, then listed what he had requested. Lisa rolled her eyes, as if she hadn't expected the boy she had raised since infancy to already be so skilled at extorting others despite only being 7 years old. Richard continued observing the sword to understand it better, so he could wield it properly. From his observation, using the sword would drain his ether. That was the risk of wielding a weapon 2 levels above his own. Normally, people only used weapons 1 level higher. However, that great risk was balanced by terrifying offensive power, so the trade-off could be considered worth it. Time passed. On the journey home, there wasn't a single attack, though Richard constantly felt as though he was being watched. By his estimation, the one watching was likely a bird-type creature with sharp eyesight like an eagle. Of course, it had to be a primordial beast, but one specialized in reconnaissance, possessing high speed and excellent stealth capabilities. After nearly half a day, they arrived near Purple Rose Village. Athena reverted to her normal form and began walking slowly. Having spent several days in the city, Richard felt a strange sensation upon returning home. He gazed at Purple Rose Village from afar. Naturally, nothing had changed. The villagers were still busy with their work as farmers. Richard even spotted Mr. Joe picking grapes, looking more energetic than usual. As they entered the village, the villagers' eyes turned to their carriage. Instead of stopping in front of the orphanage, Lisa halted the carriage before one of the villagers' homes. "Richard, you can go back on your own. Take your horse." "I'll return this carriage first," Lisa said. Richard nodded and leapt down from the carriage. Lisa, who sat on the driver's seat, had already unhitched the carriage from Athena, so Richard could leave right away. Mounting Athena, he asked her to carry him to his ancestor's place. That was more important, of course. His ancestor had to be the first one he visited. To his surprise, the hut his ancestor had built had now become a massive 3-story house with a rooftop higher than the surrounding trees, making it a place suitable both for leisure and for keeping watch over the area. His ancestor was still there, simply grilling fish on his own, looking even younger than usual. When he saw Richard, he was still taken aback. "Boy, where have you been?" "Gone for so long without giving me word," he said. Richard gave a wry smile at his words and answered, "Grandpa, my caretaker from the orphanage suddenly took me to the big city. I went along, and it was just too much fun there." "Too much fun, yet in the end you still came home. Must have been because of some trouble, right?" Aldrich replied. Richard scratched his head at that. This old man truly had so much life experience that it was all too easy for him to guess the situation. But boy, you've truly grown much stronger. Truly unexpected, Aldrich added. Hee, I got really lucky. Richard chuckled. He looked around, then showed a puzzled expression. Grandpa, where's the fire spirit queen? He asked. He didn't see the old woman, nor could he sense her presence. With his strength, he should have been able to sense her if she was hidden within the house, given that she was merely an old woman who had lost her power. Out wandering, Aldrich answered. What? Richard was stunned. While you were gone, a pink-haired girl came to your village and then came to my hut. Do you know what she did after realizing my uniqueness? She actually tried to use a slave seal on me but failed. I took her slave seal, beat her until she ran away crying. After that, I used the slave seal on the fire spirit queen. With that, I didn't hesitate to help her recover. Surprising, isn't it? At my age, to encounter such great fortune. Aldrich grinned widely as he explained everything, while Richard could only stand frozen. A pink-haired woman with a slave seal? That must have been Olivia, right? Richard thought. He couldn't believe there was anyone else with the same characteristics. Does the slave seal also work on people at your level, Grandpa? Richard asked. Yes, even people at my level can become slaves because of that item. You could say it's a serious problem for many. But if your soul is strong enough, you can still resist the seal's orders, though at the risk of death without hesitation. Death or obedience, only two choices. Remember to be careful with that thing. Aldrich warned Richard. Richard unconsciously nodded, increasingly aware of how terrifying it was. Fortunately, Olivia hadn't used the slave seal on him back then. Unexpectedly, the woman had truly come to his village. Who knew what ill fate she had planned? But perhaps fate itself did not favor her. She had the misfortune of encountering Aldrich. Her fortune had ultimately transferred to someone else. Boy, tell me, what trouble befell you that made you choose to return home? Aldrich asked. So, it's like this. Richard explained everything, that he had become the target of a mad magus who wanted to advance to the life ether realm as quickly as possible. You really are good at stirring up trouble. Aldrich couldn't help but laugh upon hearing the story, clearly considering this Richard's own fault, and indeed, it was. Grandpa, you'll help me, right, if the enemy is stronger? Richard asked. Don't worry. Aldrich patted Richard's shoulder. You are my descendant, a truly rare genius. There's no way I'd let anyone else oppress you, he said. Hearing that, Richard beamed with joy. So, what trouble is that? He wondered. He was caught off guard as he suddenly sensed someone behind a tree. When he turned his gaze there, he saw a stunning woman with long red hair, looking as though she was still in her 30s, with such graceful bearing despite wearing only a simple dress. Richard couldn't say she was more beautiful than Lilith or Olivia, but compared to the two, she clearly possessed an unrivaled aura that would make them seem like ordinary women if they stood beside her. This wasn't an aura of temperament or personality, but an aura of sheer power that had transformed into limitless charm. Richard couldn't say the woman was cold, but her expression made it seem as though she was easily angered and full of complaints. Aldrich, is this the descendant you spoke of? Why do I feel like he's so ordinary? The woman approached and spoke. Richard froze slightly at her words. He was used to surprising people. It was the first time anyone had ever called him ordinary. Eldoria, there's no need to say such things just to provoke me. Anyone with eyes can see this descendant of mine is truly extraordinary, Aldrich replied nonchalantly, not even bothering to look at her. Richard felt as though his ancestor was deliberately acting as if he didn't consider the woman, one of his greatest opponents, important at all. The woman's expression instantly darkened. But instead of Aldrich, her anger seemed directed entirely at Richard. Her red eyes seemed to hide a sea of fire yearning to burn him to ash. Richard, this woman is merely a slave, and since she isn't ready to die yet, she'll remain our slave for now. Don't take her seriously, Aldrich said casually. Ha, Grandpa, can you give her to me as my servant later? Richard replied with a laugh. Aldrich's face twitched at that, but he nodded with a chuckle. Don't worry. But wait until you're grown up first. Aldrich probably had no intention of actually handing over such an important figure as the Fire Spirit Queen to Richard, but clearly, for now, he could only go with the flow to further annoy the woman. Her face flushed red while her breath grew rapid, barely containing her boundless fury. "Anyway, Eldoria, I just picked some fruit. Please cut it for us," Aldrich said at last, turning to the Fire Spirit Queen, whose eyes widened. Yet, as though pushed by some mysterious force, she suddenly moved on her own. She picked up the fruit by the riverbank, still unwashed, and had to rinse it first. After that, she carried it to where Richard and Aldrich sat. Aldrich handed her a knife, and the woman could only accept it before beginning to cut the fruit. The anger in her eyes was palpable to Richard, and it made his heart race, as though her fury alone could make the heavens themselves seethe. Even so, Richard remained calm. He picked up a slice of fruit she had cut and ate it casually. "So delicious." "Truly, the taste of fruit depends on who cuts it," Richard remarked. "Boy, you really know how to spout nonsense," Aldrich replied. "These are just ordinary fruits. You haven't yet tasted true fruits. One day, visit the land of spirit. There, you'll find all sorts of extraordinary ones." The land of spirit was, of course, the continent where the spirit race resided. They consisted of many kinds, one of which was the fire spirit race led by the Fire Spirit Queen. Compared to the land of human, the land of spirit was said to be far more fascinating. Richard was filled with curiosity, but knew it would be a long time before he could ever go there. For now, he was still confined to a single province. Richard continued eating the fruit, listening to a few stories from his ancestor. "By the way, Grandpa, can you replace this sword's hilt with obsidora wood?" Richard asked, pulling out his golden sword and the hilt made from obsidora wood, which his ancestor had retrieved from the river. He had originally planned to sell the hilt, but since he already had plenty of money, he thought it better to use it instead. The sword's original hilt was made of iron. Richard felt much more comfortable if it were replaced with obsidora wood. "Boy, your luck is truly above average. When I was still in the ethereal realm, I didn't even have a Tier 3 weapon," Aldrich replied, taking the golden sword and the obsidora wood from Richard's hands. That's because your origins were low. I already had a Tier 4 weapon back then," the Fire Spirit Queen suddenly interjected. But Aldrich ignored her. Though the sword's hilt was fused with it, Aldrich could still separate the two. Afterward, he embedded the obsidora wood into the sword's base while coating it with his ether, instantly merging them together. "Now it's lighter," he said, returning the golden sword to Richard, who found it indeed much lighter, making it easier to swing. Meanwhile, just as Richard and Lisa had left Night Valley City, within that very city lay an area surrounded by 10-meter-high walls, filled with large wooden houses built from rare special timber. The area had no guards, yet no one dared cause trouble there, no matter if they were nobles or officials. Mrs. Wilson stood before the gates of the walled estate, stepping inside with a calm expression, though her eyes revealed her head was full of thoughts. Of course, she was thinking of ways to protect Richard. Since the enemies were Wren and the governor, there were very few people she could rely on for help. If Rebecca didn't have such personality issues, she wouldn't be struggling so much to think of who could aid Richard. As his mother, Rebecca should have been the one to help her son. But Mrs. Wilson understood the woman's nature all too well. She would not be happy if she learned about Richard. Instead, she would be furious that the child she had abandoned was not worthless trash, but rather a shining diamond. In her rage, there was no telling what she might do. Thus, Mrs. Wilson hadn't even considered asking Rebecca for help. Instead, she had come to the Moonshadow clan's territory. At the very least, in this clan, there was still someone she could turn to for aid: Leonardo Moonshadow, the clan's former leader and Richard's own grandfather. He was truly a formidable figure. Although he only possessed Tier 2 ether, his realm was extremely high. He commanded enough strength to be respected across the entire kingdom. His personality was also good. He loved his grandchildren, including Grace, who was only his adopted granddaughter. Mrs. Wilson simply wasn't sure how he would react when hearing about a grandson he had never known. Still, she believed he would surely help. The Moonshadow clan's estate was quiet, with hardly anyone around except servants tending to the courtyards. Many members were away, either wandering the city or elsewhere. Several servants greeted Mrs. Wilson, but she was too preoccupied with her thoughts to respond. She continued walking until she reached a small vineyard filled with all kinds of rare grapes. A man who appeared to be in his 50s, with black hair partly streaked with white, was watering the vines. He looked simple, wearing only plain robes, exuding none of the overwhelming aura that powerful people often had. If anything stood out, it was only his face, still strikingly handsome and charming despite his middle-aged appearance. "Sir," Mrs. Wilson greeted the man, bowing slightly out of respect. Leonardo Moonshadow disliked overly formal titles. Long ago, he had ordered the servants to address him simply as Sir. "Wilson, it's rare for you to come here. Something must have happened, right?" The man smiled casually at Mrs. Wilson, not stopping his watering. Mrs. Wilson nodded calmly. "Tell me what the problem is. I'll help if I can." "After all, you've been serving my daughter all this time," Leonardo said. "Sir, this is related to your grandchild," replied Mrs. Wilson. "My grandchild? Who?" "Grace, Jack." Leonardo was puzzled by Mrs. Wilson's words. "No, but your grandchild you don't know about, the baby born to Lady Rebecca 7 years ago." As those words left Mrs. Wilson's lips, Leonardo instantly dropped the bucket he had been using to water his vines. He froze, utterly shocked. "Your grandchild is still alive. He didn't die. Lady Rebecca only asked me to send him to an orphanage." Mrs. Wilson continued as Leonardo remained frozen in place. The latter gasped for breath when he heard that. "How's he now?" Leonardo asked. "You must have heard of the genius boy from Appletown recently, haven't you?" asked Mrs. Wilson. Though the news had spread, Leonardo might not have known about it, since he lived in seclusion and rarely received information unless it concerned clan matters. But Leonardo lightly nodded, his eyes narrowing with interest, instantly suspecting something. "He is Lady Rebecca's son. He was raised in my hometown by my niece, becoming a prodigy who has already reached the ethereal realm at the age of 7. Many think he's just lucky, but in truth, he's even cultivating ether tier 3. Even my granddaughter and daughter were not this extraordinary," Leonardo blurted out. "Your grandson's talent surpasses your imagination, sir," replied Mrs. Wilson. "But now he's being targeted by the governor and his son, Ren, who wish to force their way into the life ether realm." "What?" Leonardo instantly grew furious upon hearing that. His voice burst forth together with his power, shaking the entire clan territory. It rumbled like thunder, startling many servants to the point of collapsing in fear. "How dare those little bastards," he said, full of rage. "Sir, you must protect your grandson, but it's best you keep this a secret from Lady Rebecca," Mrs. Wilson said. She was certain Leonardo understood the true reason Rebecca had sent her son to the orphanage. If he truly cared for Richard, he had to know what was best, for if Rebecca lost control, even he would be unable to stop her. Leonardo nodded, his eyes turning colder. 8-Star Province. "It's about time the governor changed," he said in a low but resolute voice. Night fell over Purple Rose Village, yet Richard could neither focus on cultivation nor sleep. He still felt the presence of someone watching him from afar. But he waited and waited. There were no signs of those who sought to capture him. Through the long night, he remained on guard, but until the sun rose again, no one ever came. Richard. Sister Lisa came to his room with delight. "Nothing happened." "That means my aunt has managed to find help for you," she said. Richard nodded when he heard this, sharing the same thought. "Who could it be that's helping?" he asked. He was quite sure Mrs. Wilson wouldn't ask Rebecca for aid, but who else could stop the governor of Night Valley City? "I don't know." Lisa shook her head, as if she had no guesses. Perhaps her guess was Lady Rebecca, but she wasn't certain. Richard pondered a moment before stopping himself. What happened in Night Valley City was beyond his reach for now, and he wasn't so curious as to dwell on it. Ding! Your ether has increased from 3260 to 3270. Ether, 3270/10,000, Tier 3, plus 10. Ether accumulation, 8270, Tier 3. Suddenly, he received a notification. "Sister, I'll be going out for a while," Richard said after receiving the notification. He stepped out of his room and drank from his ether bottle, which was filled right as the system granted him the ether increase. Ether, 3280/10,000, Tier 3, plus 10. Ether accumulation, 8280, Tier 3. Only an increase of 20. Richard didn't find it all that impressive. Leaving the orphanage, he observed his surroundings. He wanted to locate the beast that had been watching him until now. Even if its master died, it would likely continue to observe. There was no way he would allow that. Yesterday, his ancestor had taught him how to find the Watcher beast using his abilities. He had deliberately left it alone through the night, hoping his enemies would come for him. Unfortunately, they never did. After some time surveying the area, he walked toward a quiet yet open place. Whoosh! He spread an extremely thin wave, though it consumed an enormous amount of ether. When a wave was thin, it could reach vastly greater distances even with a single ether. Yet Richard poured thousands into it at once. The wave easily extended to a radius of several dozen kilometers, with him at the center. The wave could be used much like the sixth sense. Though not able to see directly, at the very least he could sense the creatures within its range. The entire Black Rose village was enveloped by his wave. He could feel every villager and every animal. He even discovered some villagers making love in the early morning, their passion evident in the vigor of their movements. But his focus shifted farther away, to the birds flying high above, searching for the one staring at him. He kept expanding the reach of his wave, unhesitant to spend all his ether even though it left him drained. At last, his wave reached as far as 15 kilometers, and he finally located a hawk, smaller than an ordinary one, that seemed to hover without moving its wings. The hawk was staring at him, seemingly without even blinking. I didn't think it would be this far, Richard thought. But he had prepared since last night. Whoosh! From his window, a shadow hawk shot into the sky. He had created this shadow hawk the previous night, ready to capture the Watcher. Since it was too busy staring at him, it never noticed the shadow hawk racing toward it from another direction. It seemed to have only a weak instinct for danger, its ability limited to following and watching. Richard's shadow hawk easily closed in from behind, seizing it with its long claws before carrying it back toward him. The Watcher hawk struggled, but it could not escape the grip of the shadow hawk's talons. Though it had been far away, the swift shadow hawk arrived before Richard in no time. Richard gazed at the hawk brought before him. It was pure white, even smaller than a crow, yet truly a hawk. Its eyes were huge and transparent, its wings sharp and cutting. In front of him, the hawk resisted more violently, making it clear that it was utterly loyal to its master. Bang! Richard struck the hawk hard at the neck, bending it unnaturally. Killing it, for this was the only way to deal with it. The hawk truly was weak in defense. It died from a single strike of Richard's fist. At the same time, Richard's spreading wave suddenly detected another bird rushing swiftly toward Purple Rose Village. Richard grew intrigued by this bird, for a scroll was tied to its leg. He watched as it flew into the village before heading to the orphanage. Perhaps from Mrs. Wilson. Richard made a guess. He returned to the orphanage and saw Sister Lisa receiving the bird out front, untying the scroll from its leg. "Richard, this is from my aunt. Quickly read it. I'm sure she's sent news of what happened." Lisa eagerly handed the scroll to Richard. After receiving it, Richard immediately opened it. "Richard, are you safe? I have good news for you. The governor has been killed and his teacher Oldwood has fled with serious injuries. Now Ren no longer has his supporter. He's even being hunted down because a sudden mission appeared to kill him, with a reward of 30,000 spirit souls for anyone who succeeds. His whereabouts are currently unknown." Richard's mouth hung open as he read the news. The governor had been killed. Though Mrs. Wilson hadn't said whether it was connected to the person she asked for help, Richard was sure it was because of them. To be able to kill the governor, that person was naturally powerful. Richard couldn't help but wonder who it was. Of course, the most interesting part was that Ren was being hunted because of a mission to kill him. Richard pondered who could have issued such a mission. He didn't think it was Mrs. Wilson, it was likely someone else had a stake in Ren's death. Who else if not Gray? Richard, what did my aunt say? Lisa asked. Like this. Richard read the contents of the letter aloud. And Lisa instantly grew excited about the mission to kill Ren. 30,000 spirit souls. We'd be rich if we got it, she blurted out. Richard only gave a wry smile at that. It was indeed a tempting reward, but where could anyone even find Ren? For such a mission to exist, it likely meant Ren had already disappeared without leaving a trace. It would be nice if he somehow came to me, he thought. But as that thought crossed his mind, Richard's eyes widened. Suddenly, he saw a massive hawk flying at tremendous speed from the distance. It was so fast, and upon its back stood a black-robed man. Ren. Richard was certain it was him, already familiar with his figure. He had truly come to him. Shwa. In Richard's hand, dozens of spirit souls appeared. He quickly sent them into his mouth. Having consumed much ether in spreading his wide-ranging wave, he was depleted. To recover quickly, spirit souls were his only solution. Swallowing dozens at once, his ether rapidly filled to the brim. Although he had his mind attack that could throw Ren into disarray, he still needed to be ready to fight such an opponent head-on. At this moment, he began to feel Ren's gaze fixed upon him. Though there were many people in the village, Ren's eyes seemed directly linked to him, finding him instantly. He actually came here. Sister Lisa realized too late, but when she saw Ren, she immediately activated her armor, transforming into a raven-armored knight. The villagers and orphans were shocked by her sudden transformation. But they had no time to dwell on it. The arrival of the great hawk carrying Ren unleashed a mighty gust of wind that swept through the village. Stop! Sister Lisa shouted. Yet Ren seemed to pay no heed to those around him. His hawk soared over the village road, diving swiftly toward Richard. Several villagers were flung into the air by the powerful gust. Sister, leave this to me. Richard pulled Sister Lisa behind him and thrust his hand forward. Whoosh! 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 10 shadow hawks manifested before him. Each was as large as the hawk Ren rode, stretching nearly 4 meters long. They surged forth, crashing into Ren's hawk, which was caught off guard and unable to evade. Their claws tore into its body from many sides, sending it plummeting at once. One shadow hawk even tried to stab Ren with its beak. But a swing of Ren's massive sword forced the shadow hawk back into pure shadow, its beak passing harmlessly through him. The man then leapt onto a villager's rooftop, staring at Richard in disbelief. Shadow beasts, how do you possess this arcane art? Isn't this the Moonshadow clan's arcane art? He exclaimed. He had meant to arrive with words full of threat, but instead, he was stunned by Richard's power far beyond his expectations. Humph. Richard smirked coldly. A mind attack, he sent it into Ren once more. The man's eyes went wide, but unlike last time, Richard found him able to remain steady under the attack. Though his strength fell drastically, he no longer lost all control. It seemed he had advanced in resisting this weakness. But so what? He was still weakened, and to Richard's eyes, weakened far more than someone of his strength should be. You should never have come to me, Richard said. As he spoke, he aimed the Ignis Volt core at Ren. It began to glow. Under Ren's widening eyes, a blazing laser wrapped in violent lightning shot forth from the golden coin. The chance to kill him had come far sooner than expected. And so, Richard would kill him all the sooner. The laser was so fast, Ren had no time to dodge or block, nor was it even possible for him to withstand it. It struck his chest, directly at his heart, piercing through with ease before streaking far into the sky beyond. By the time Ren realized what had happened, the light of life had already faded from his eyes. Bang! He crashed heavily to the ground, his chest hollowed and smoking. Buzz! Black smoke erupted from every orifice, eyes, nose, mouth, right after his death, spreading with a sinister aura of evil. Is he dead? Sister Lisa, removing her helmet, asked in astonishment, never expecting Ren to die so quickly after his arrival. Lisa thought she and Richard would have to fight together through an intense battle to defeat Ren. She wasn't even sure they could win. Naturally, Richard couldn't admit that he too was surprised by how quickly it ended. He thought that, even without the mind attack, he might already be on par with a Tier 10 beast. He approached Ren's corpse, which had fallen from the roof onto the ground, and picked up his massive sword. It was a Tier 2 weapon, definitely something worth keeping. After that, Richard took Ren's ring and peeked inside, only to be stunned when he found just 10 spirit orbs and a strange red chain with spearheads on each end. Nothing else. That red chain caught his interest because of its eerie aura. Could it be? Why had Ren still come after him? The reason might have been that he was still carrying on with his plan. And what he needed next was none other than Richard himself. Looks like this chain is what he was going to use. How does it work? Could it absorb me into his body? Richard's face twitched at the thought. I hope I won't have to deal with people like this again, he thought. Unfortunately, this was something he could never avoid from the start, since Ren had been the one who first sent his lackeys to massacre the village. And now, I'm no longer just an ordinary boy. Richard noticed the villagers' stares, some of them even rubbed their eyes to make sure they weren't seeing things. At first, only Mr. Joe knew, but now all the villagers had seen. Richard hadn't yet decided how he would deal with the villagers to prevent them from carelessly spreading what they had witnessed. Perhaps Sister Lisa could handle that. He first stored Ren's corpse inside one of the small space rings he had received from Lilith. After that, he wrote a letter to Mrs. Wilson, explaining what had happened here. He attached the letter to the bird that had delivered Mrs. Wilson's message, along with the ring containing Ren's body. In the letter, he asked Mrs. Wilson to help claim the bounty, since he had no plans of returning to Night Valley City. He intended to stay in this village and focus on training, avoiding further trouble. Richard returned to the orphanage, went to his room, sat down, and began absorbing ether. From morning to afternoon, continuing into night until midnight, he finally fell asleep. Ether, 3480/10-000, Tier 3, plus 200. Ether accumulation, 8480 Tier 3. As a result, he gained an additional 200 ether. Ding! Your affinity with the cloud element has increased from 70% to 80%. Cloud, 80%. When he woke up at midday, he saw the system notification. Only the cloud element. He felt a bit dissatisfied, hoping for additional affinities so that his powers could become more versatile. Richard, come. You will receive a new codex and arcane art from the Fire Spirit Queen. Suddenly, he heard his ancestor's voice echoing in his mind. A new codex and arcane art from the Fire Spirit Queen. Richard's eyes shone with excitement at the news. This was far too tempting to ignore. Not caring about his disheveled appearance, he immediately went into the forest with Athena. His mind buzzed with imagination, wondering what they might be like. In no time, he arrived at his ancestor's hut, where he found Aldrich sitting with 2 books laid out before him. The Fire Spirit Queen herself was nowhere to be seen. Come. Aldrich waved him over, urging him to hurry. Richard leapt down from Athena's back and ran toward him. His eyes immediately fixed on the 2 books, which turned out to look like ordinary notebooks. Take them. 1 codex and 1 arcane art, the finest of the fire spirit race, Aldrich said. Richard quickly picked one up and opened its first page. Codex of Endless Flame, a codex that allows you to absorb Tier 3 ether, containing an innate arcane art, Flame Transformation. This arcane art grants you the ability to transform into fire itself. You may use it right from the start, even with just 1% mastery of the codex. Is this real? I can use the innate arcane art immediately. Richard asked in surprise. Yes. It allows you to turn into fire. This codex is unique in that it can unleash much of its power even at low mastery. If mastered further, it will not only accelerate your training, but also raise your fire element affinity beyond 90%, Aldrich explained in detail. Richard nodded and continued reading through the book until he had finished. Ding! You have obtained the Codex of Endless Flame. Your mastery of the Codex of Endless Flame has increased from 0% to 10%. Codexes. Codex of Dragon Emperor, 40%. Codex of Moonshadow, 14%. Codex of Endless Flame, 10%. Innate Arcane Art from Codex of Endless Flame. Flame Transformation, 10%. Richard was stunned by the system's first boost. Normally, it was only 3%, but this time it had jumped straight to 10%. What do you think? It may be extremely difficult for you to train this codex since it was designed for the fire spirit race, but with your monstrous talent, you should succeed, Aldrich said again. Richard unconsciously nodded while replying, I will do my best. Don't even think about mastering it to 1%. Even if you had 90% fire element affinity, you are not a fire spirit. Suddenly, Richard heard the voice of the fire spirit queen. She emerged from within the forest, looking just as she had yesterday, her expression still carrying deep-seated anger. Had she still been in her withered old woman form, she would have looked utterly terrifying with that face. Queen, what if I can? Richard replied. Can? The queen smirked with a mocking expression. If you can, I swear I'll give you anything you desire, and I will not resist the power of the slave seal on my body, the queen declared. Richard hadn't expected her to say that. Perhaps she was simply too frustrated now. But those were only words. She could always break them if she wanted. Even bound by the slave seal, if pushed too far, she could still commit suicide. Eldoria, if you dare, bind your oath with world magic ether, Aldrich suddenly spoke. You think I'm afraid, the queen retorted before raising her gaze to the sky. You hear me, world magic ether, bind my oath, make it so I cannot break it, she said coldly. On the other side, Richard was puzzled. This was the first time he had ever heard of such a thing. This is for people at our level, Aldrich suddenly spoke, knowing Richard needed an explanation. What do you mean, grandfather? Richard asked. You see, the world magic ether appears in every era. When someone obtains it, another one will appear, though still hidden. But without a doubt, the world magic ether is the power of the entire world. Whoever possesses it becomes as strong as the world itself. Even without being owned by anyone, the world magic ether practically has the power to suppress anyone. If someone binds their oath with the world magic ether, it will ensure they uphold that oath and no one can break it. It is far more terrifying than a slave seal because it can even prevent someone from committing suicide. This was something Richard had never heard before. He couldn't help but be amazed. Are only people at your level capable of binding an oath with the world magic ether? He asked again. Yes, because only we are acknowledged by the world magic ether. The rest are nothing more than ants, unworthy of attention, Aldrich explained with a tone of pride. After hearing his explanation, Richard turned his gaze toward the fire spirit queen. You may regret your words, he said. Say that when you master it, the woman replied before leaving once more. She still can't accept her fate, but that's understandable. After all, she once stood at the peak of the world, only to awaken as an enslaved old woman. Most people would go insane. Aldrich chuckled. He didn't notice Richard's quiet smile. Richard then opened the second book, which contained an arcane art. Flame Lotus Arcane Art allows you to transform your flames into lotus fire capable of destroying the world. Each 1% mastery increases the number of fire lotuses you can unleash with the same amount of ether. You can also merge your fire lotuses into a larger one, and you can combine other elements into your fire lotus to create a stronger lotus. Richard, this is the strongest arcane art owned by the Fire Spirit Queen. She relied on it to burn vast lands. Don't think it's just a fire lotus. Truth is, it can appear directly beneath the target and ignite everything above it. To be honest, even at that time, I struggled to escape from it because the heat made it difficult for me to move. Aldrich gave Richard additional details. Richard nodded without saying a word, immediately reading the book's contents. Ding! You have obtained the Flame Lotus Arcane Art. Your mastery of the Flame Lotus Arcane Art has increased from 0% to 10%. Arcane Arts. 100 Shadow Monster, 19%. Lighting of Darkness, 19%. Mind Attack, 13%. Flame Lotus, 10%. If the Fire Spirit Queen finds out about this, I hope she doesn't go insane, Richard thought. For this arcane art, the chances of you mastering it are greater, Aldrich said. Richard remained silent, only nodding. Grandfather, I'll be going now, Richard said. Aldrich allowed him to leave. That night, after dinner, Richard was once again visited by the bird sent by Mrs. Wilson. It came straight to his room without meeting Lisa first. It carried a letter and a ring. Richard immediately took them both. He opened the letter first. Fortunately, you won. I didn't expect Ren to head toward Purple Rose Village. Inside your ring, there are 30,000 nature spirits as a reward for the mission to kill Ren. The entire Night Valley City is in an uproar over his death. People are wondering who managed to kill him. Because he is dead, the tournament organizers had no choice but to reinstate Gray to replace Ren. Richard smiled as he read the letter, which described the situation in Night Valley City. Afterward, he checked the ring, finding a massive pile of nature spirits. Who would have thought he would obtain the same amount as he did from Lilith and the sale of Cimmerland? With his wealth increasing, Richard decided to train through the night without rest, not stopping even when morning came, and continued further. During his training, the system gave him a notification. Your affinity with the cloud element has increased from 80% to 90%. Your mastery of the Flame Lotus arcane art has increased from 10% to 12%. Cloud, 90%. Flame Lotus, 12%. Richard paused briefly upon receiving the notification, but he didn't dwell on it. He knew the system's increase was more significant because of the addition of one codex and the arcane art. He continued training until he accumulated 200 total ether, 100 absorbed directly and 100 from an ether bottle. Ether, 3680/10,000, Tier 3, plus 200. Ether accumulation, 8680, Tier 3. Perhaps I'll advance when I'm 8 years old, he thought. He always kept track of his age. In about a week, he would turn 8. However, birthdays weren't important in this world. Few people celebrated them, since most didn't even remember their exact date of birth. They usually only had an estimate of their total age. Richard was utterly exhausted after training nonstop from night until noon. But he didn't feel like sleeping. He stepped out of his room, only to find Sister Lisa examining a rather wide silver sword. Sister. Richard approached and greeted her, his gaze falling on the sword in her hand. Richard, you've been locked away in your room for so long. What have you been doing? Lisa asked, a little surprised to see him. Of course I was training, Richard replied. Sister, where did you get that sword? Richard asked next. He thought it was a Tier 2 weapon. For someone like Lisa, it wouldn't be easy to obtain such a weapon. Besides, Lilith had never given her weapons, only armor. I've had this for a long time, Lisa answered with a smile. Oh, did you buy it? No, I found it during an adventure. I just kept it at my home. If I didn't have the sky armor, I wouldn't be able to use it, because when its power activates, this sword becomes far too heavy. Lisa explained. By the way, this morning I received a raven from Lilith. She said she would meet you tonight, but she asked you to come to Apple Town, she added. Has she already entered this territory? Richard was both shocked and excited by Sister Lisa's words. After all, Lilith's arrival meant he would obtain the 1,000 ether he desired. I don't know. Honestly, I'm confused why she didn't choose to come directly to this village, Sister Lisa replied. Richard wasn't sure either, but wherever it was, it didn't matter to him. He quickly prepared himself, taking a bath, eating, and putting on new clothes. By evening, he set off toward Apple Town alone. He chose not to bring Sister Lisa because he felt freer when by himself. Athena ran swiftly while carrying him, though she didn't reveal her form as a primordial beast with royal bloodline. Thanks to her speed, the sun hadn't yet set when they arrived in Apple Town. Richard was no longer impressed by this small town after spending several days in Night Valley City. Still, he had to admit that the town had at least one remarkable figure like Olivia, who had truly grown up in Apple Town. The woman wasn't as famous as Gray or Ren. Her name was known only within this small Apple Town. To outsiders, she might not seem that strong. But Richard, who had witnessed her power firsthand, knew she could look down on Gray and Ren, since she was clearly their peer in age. Even so, she was likely already in the life ether realm when Richard first saw her, otherwise she wouldn't have dared stand unafraid before the town's ruler. Richard entered the town inconspicuously, like any other village boy. It wasn't yet night, and he didn't know where he was supposed to meet Lilith, so he decided to wander around the small town first. His destination was the area of the magic shops. The last time he had been there, he had been lucky. How could he not return, hoping for another stroke of fortune? However, this time he wore the phantom cloak, anticipating potential trouble since he didn't know what had happened after his deception. And the moment he arrived, he immediately found out what had happened. He actually saw several people holding paintings of his own face, talking about the boy who bought Cimera land for 5 nature spirits. When Richard asked one of them, he finally learned what had transpired after he had left. This made him hesitate. Why hasn't the town ruler come after me, knowing I bought Cimera land? If he wanted to, he could have found me. Unless he's afraid. Richard wore a strange expression as he speculated. He truly believed the town ruler was afraid. The man should have realized he was Richard. If he hadn't chased him, fear was the only explanation. Otherwise, the only alternative was laziness. But even then, Richard didn't dwell on it too much. He began browsing the shops one by one, searching for anything that might stir his instincts. Unfortunately, such luck seemed rarer than diamonds among stones. Even after going back and forth through several shops, he found nothing. The sky began to darken, and most of Appletown's residents shifted into a more leisurely pace. Richard continued strolling, intending to stop at a restaurant, only to be startled by the sight of 2 figures sitting in the corner, causing him to take a step back. Gray and Laura. He could hardly believe they had appeared in Appletown. They weren't even from the 8-star province, and even if they were, it was still shocking for figures like them to come to Appletown, especially since they hailed from another province entirely. It seemed impossible that they would have business in such a remote place. Richard observed them for a moment before deciding to enter the restaurant. He ordered food and sat at a table next to them. The 2 of them were, of course, busy talking while eating, even appearing to be in a serious discussion. But Richard couldn't hear their words. Gray was using his power to block their voices. Even sixth sense was barred from penetrating. In this situation, Richard could do nothing, but he felt as if they were waiting for someone, so he remained seated, beginning to eat when his food arrived. Whether Gray or Laura, neither of them seemed to care in the slightest about the cloaked figure beside them. Before long, Richard noticed another person wearing a phantom cloak entering the restaurant. He narrowed his eyes, feeling a sense of familiarity with this person. The phantom cloak might conceal nearly every detail, even making gender unguessable, but not all phantom cloaks could alter height. Could it be that woman? Richard wondered, thinking of Olivia. He suspected it was her from the figure's height. Moreover, the phantom cloak that person wore looked exactly like the one Olivia had once lent him. As he expected, the figure he suspected to be Olivia approached Gray and Laura. She casually sat right in front of them. Richard grew more certain it was Olivia when he observed her manner of sitting. Then, the 3 began speaking more seriously, clearly discussing a potential cooperation. What could they possibly be seeking in such a remote region? Richard was fairly sure they wouldn't cooperate unless it was to obtain something extraordinary. But while he was still watching them, he suddenly heard Lilith's voice inside his head. "Boy, come meet me." Not only did he hear her voice, but Richard could faintly sense her location. That was more important. Richard immediately left for Lilith's location. She was in a park, standing alone, wearing a hooded robe that covered her head. But it wasn't a phantom cloak, so her face was still visible. "Sister Lilith." Richard quickly greeted her with a bright smile upon seeing her, removing his phantom cloak. He felt uncomfortable hiding himself from someone who knew him well and had business with him. "Sister, why didn't you come directly to Purple Rose Village?" Richard asked. For Lilith, reaching Purple Rose Village would only take a few minutes. Richard didn't think it was mere laziness. There had to be a reason. Lilith didn't answer right away. Instead, she gave Richard a curious look. "Tell me, boy, who's hiding around that village?" "I sensed 2 very dangerous presences there," she said, narrowing her eyes sharply. Richard was stunned, his mouth slightly open, his expression freezing. He hadn't expected her to ask this. Naturally, he was unsure what to say in response. Pretend ignorance? Lilith might then order him to leave the village, or she would investigate herself. After thinking it over, Richard answered, "Sister, don't worry about them. They're not dangerous to me." "Are they the source of your fortune?" Lilith asked. The question made Richard awkward. The answer could be yes, but not entirely, since he had many sources of fortune, his system, and Mr. Joe. "Anyway, sister, where's the item I wanted?" Richard shifted the topic. He didn't feel awkward discussing this, because that item was his rightful due. Lilith pouted upon hearing that, still looking quite angry that he had demanded it. Even so, she took something out, a wheel that appeared to be made of crystal. The star wheel. Richard's eyes widened at the sight. "This holds over 1,000 Tier 3 ether remnants. I'll release them and seal the park so they won't scatter. You can absorb them," Lilith said. "Sister, as a princess, you clearly have the authority to take star wheels from the kingdom for your own use. I must have been wrong not to ask for more. Wouldn't it have been better if the star will still contain 3,000 Tier 3 ether?" Richard remarked. "Humph." Lilith snorted at his words. "Don't think I got this for free," she snapped angrily, but Richard only chuckled, deliberately teasing her. "In that case, sister, please help me release the ether from the star wheel," Richard said. He sat down, ready to cultivate. Lilith still pouted, but she set the seal, similar to the one the governor had used on the star wheel. Buzz. The remaining Tier 3 ether inside surged outward. Richard, seated right in front of the star wheel, could feel all of it and immediately began absorbing it into his body. Of course, since he was in front of Lilith, he couldn't take out the ether bottle. This would have to be full manual absorption. Patiently, Richard absorbed the ether from the star wheel. Hours passed, and he could feel a clear increase in his power. After who knows how many hours, he finally stopped, wearing a satisfied smile. Ether, 4683/10,000, Tier 3, plus 1003. Ether accumulation, 9683, Tier 3. It turned out to be even more than he wanted. There had actually been more, but Richard had only managed to absorb that much. Even if it was less, he wouldn't have minded much, as long as the amount was close to 1,000. Lilith quickly stored the star wheel, then said, "Quickly, use mind attack." "Sister Lilith, please be careful," Richard replied, locking eyes with her before sending the mind attack as she had requested. When the mind attack entered her mind, Richard was the first to be shocked. Her mental strength was so formidable that his mind attack seemed to have no effect on her at all, even though she wasn't resisting it. He realized this was due to the difference in level, but the result was still difficult for him to accept. Lilith, however, remained calm, focusing intently on what had entered her head.